Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a beautiful day. I know there's a lot of things you could be doing today other than coming here and listening to what's going to be a wonderful history lesson. So thank you all for coming out. My name is Bob Moore. I'm the editor of the El Paso Times. And you might ask what I'm doing up here, because I certainly am asking that too, especially looking at this distinguished panel who really knows what they're talking about. But the reason I'm here is Adair. Perfect timing as always, Adair. Thank you. Adair and I met more than a year ago as we were actually discussing Tom Lee Month for 2012 and what was going to go on. And I told Adair when we were meeting there, one of the things that struck me as odd is that Lyndon Johnson had such a profound effect on El Paso, but in all of my years living here, I don't recall anybody doing a presentation on Lyndon Johnson's impact on El Paso. And she says, "That's a wonderful idea. Thanks for volunteering to be in charge of it." Adair and the folks at the Tom Lee Institute certainly have done really all the heavy lifting in lining up some really wonderful presentations. Those of you who were with us last night got to hear, I think, just a really touching and informative presentation from Michael Gillette from Humanities Texas about Lady Bird Johnson, and then a brief taste of what Gus Sanchez has to offer, our new superintendent of the Chamizal, and I'll introduce Gus in a second. So we got off to a wonderful start last night, and today should be even more invigorating. We have several panels that will really explore some different facets of President Johnson's life and his impact in El Paso in particular, and surprisingly, his deep roots in El Paso. I think most of you who are familiar with history know the story of how President Johnson was elected to the Senate in 1948. He was running against a very popular former governor of Texas named Coke Stevenson, and it was a very pitched race, and I think Robert Caro probably has the best description of that race if you want to go back and read it. But President Johnson, or then Congressman Johnson, wound up winning that race by 87 votes out of more than 1 million cast, forever earning the nickname, I heard it right over from Sam, Landslide Lyndon. And some of you may know that Mr. Johnson may have owed his victory to some shenanigans in Duval County, down in the Rio Grande Valley, where some ballots kind of magically turned up late, and so there's always this legend that George Parr, man known as the Duke of Duval County, is the one who really launched Lyndon Johnson on the road to the White House. I take some issue with that. I think we in El Paso can claim some credit for that. In that 1948 election, Lyndon Johnson came to El Paso and campaigned in the runoff against Governor Stevenson. Governor Stevenson never came to El Paso then, as now. We were sort of at the nether regions of Texas, and it was hard to get political attention, but Lyndon Johnson made sure to come out and give El Paso the attention it deserved, and as a result, he won El Paso County by about 3,300 votes. He beat Governor Stevenson by about 2-1. So the way I look at it, if it had not been for Lyndon Johnson's overwhelming popularity in El Paso, he never would have been in position to steal the election in Duval County. So we can claim some credit for that. So the first panel we have today, we'll talk about probably the most visible legacy of Lyndon Johnson in El Paso, and that's the settlement that eventually ended a long dispute with Mexico over boundary issues in the Chamizal area. And Lyndon Johnson's interest in this preceded by a number of years his ascendancy to the vice presidency and then eventually the presidency, and we'll hear some discussion about that. But the Chamizal Treaty, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and a bit of good timing for us, really settled what was a thorn in the side of U.S.-Mexico relationships going back for a century. And Lyndon and certainly President Kennedy deserves a lot of credit for that settlement and his counterparts in Mexico. But Lyndon Johnson also played an important role, and we'll hear some of that from our panelists today. But we have just a wonderful panel many of whom were witnesses to key moments in the Chamizal Treaty negotiations, and then eventually the settlement, and then the implementation of the settlement that really sort of reshaped, literally reshaped the boundary area and what is now the Chamizal National Memorial and the Bowie High School area. And I'll start from your left, my right here, with just brief introductions. First, we have Travis Johnson, who is one of the definitive political figures in 20th century El Paso history, especially late 20th century history. He was county judge, has been deeply involved in virtually every facet of the emergence of El Paso over the last 50 years. Next to him is Nestor Valencia, who was an urban planner for the city of El Paso for a number of years, and then after retiring from the city of El Paso, came to work for the El Paso Community Foundation and continued to do some marvelous development work for our community. Most notably, I think, the room and the facility we're sitting in today. And Nestor was very instrumental in revitalizing the Plaza Theater and the area around it. Next to Nestor is Gus Sanchez. Gus is the new superintendent of the Chamizal National Memorial. He's been here since May, is that right, Gus?
Yes.
And I think most of you know the original plan was to have this discussion where it should be, which is at the Chamizal National Memorial. We had some great plans. We met with Gus and his staff for months to really pull this together. And then Congress happened. And we had to scramble. Gus is one of the 800,000 or so furloughed government employees. Gus is actually here today as a private citizen, not as the superintendent of the Chamizal, because it would actually be a crime for him to work. So we appreciate private citizen Sanchez coming out today. Next to Gus is Cruzito. Cruz had a very long and distinguished career with the International Boundary and Water Commission, which was really the key agency that was involved in really the heavy lifting of the Chamizal, how to handle all of the technical issues with the river and with the land, and he worked with perhaps the most important people in the whole Chamizal development, and I'll let him explain that. Next to him is Sam Moore, a longtime El Paso attorney and legendary trout fisherman. I think it's the latter that he's most proud of. Sam was, again, deeply involved in a lot of political developments in El Paso over the last 40 to 50 years, and personally had the opportunity to witness some key moments in the development of the Chamizal Treaty, and saw, as he'll explain to you, some really masterful diplomacy at work. And then finally, at the end of the table, we have Nick Hauser, who is a historian and author, and is deeply involved, obviously, in the 12 Travelers Project and a lot of the research that's gone into the 12 Travelers development. He's currently focusing a lot of energy on the study of Benito Juarez, who, of course, played a very significant role in the development of our area here. And we look forward to hearing Nick's comments. So now I'll turn it over to the panel, and I'm going to try to stay out of the way as much as possible. And I'd like to start with Travis, if I might.
Probably loud enough where you can hear me without the microphone. Sally, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I think that's fine. Thank you. Over the years, I have been asked to talk about the settlement. And after I get through the talk, I always ask the people in the audience if they have any questions. And one question always comes up. Well, what did El Paso get out of it? That's what we want to know. What were the benefits for El Paso? And I want to tell you the benefits, thanks to LBJ and a lot of people, a lot of the leaders here, we got a lot out of it. We did very well. LBJ was very enthusiastic about having the local leadership here involved and supportive of the settlement of this dispute. He was dedicated to trying to get all of us on board. And the politics then was just like it is now, very, very muddled, I don't have to explain that to you. But in addition to seeing to it that the people that were displaced, the landowners, got adequate compensation for their land, we came up with three things, I call them perks, that we wanted. And LBJ agreed to wholeheartedly support us in trying to get these three things that we wanted. One of them was the border highway. The other one was, it's called the Chamizal National Memorial. I call it the Chamizal Park. So if I say park, it's the Chamizal National Memorial. And the third one was the extension, 13-mile extension of the American Canal. And those are the three things that we wanted. And the president wholeheartedly agreed to make that part of his package and endorse us and help us. The problem is that all three of these things call for legislation. LBJ couldn't just write us a check and say, here you go, here's your deal, go ahead. We had to go to Congress and we had to put up a fight for the legislation, but it was considered to be White House sponsored legislation. Senator Yarborough agreed to handle the legislation, the three legislative bills on the Senate side, and Congressman Richard White agreed to handle the legislation on the House side. Commissioner Joe Friedkin, he was the IBWC commissioner who was designated, and Cruz will talk more about that later, to handle all of the activities. Commissioner Friedkin and Mayor Judson Williams put together a team to go to Washington on a number of occasions and lobby and testify before the different congressional committees on these three pieces of legislation. The team that they put together was Judson Williams, representing the city of El Paso, and I was the county judge at that time, and I was representing the county of El Paso. Dr. Charles was the superintendent of the El Paso Independent School District. He was on the team. And then, representing the El Paso Chamber of Commerce were two of our prominent business people who they both served as president of the El Paso Chamber. Ray Lockhart, who some of you knew, who was the president of the electric company, and Fred Hervey. And everybody was on the same page. I was kind of like a moderate Democrat, and those of you that knew Hervey, he was a very conservative Republican. But we were always committed to work on this, and we did work on it. And we had one ex officio member that went with us and helped us write our speeches and carry the suitcases and things like that. And it was your colleague, Jonathan Cunningham, who you know real well. That was a team. We made these trips. I was always, because I was considered to be a liberal Democrat, I was the one that had to go give the briefings to Ralph Yarborough and to Jim Wright. Judson was kind of a moderate Republican, so he went and gave the briefings to Richard White. And then we had Hervey go talk to John Tower, and we broke it up that way. the legislation, the border highway went through pretty easily. We didn't have a lot of problems with that. And then we got to the park. The park, and I'm gonna call it the park now. I've already told you what the official name is. The park was underneath the jurisdiction, like it is now, of the National Park Service. Well, we ran into some problems on that because every congressman wants a National Park Service in their area. You know, they all would like to have some sort of a national park facility in their district. So in that, we had a little bit more trouble with that one. All of us, the whole team had to testify before the Senate and before the Congress. And it was a little bit more lobbying effort, and we had to exert ourselves. But it passed too. So we got the two bills passed, and I feel fortunate in that LBJ gave me pins from the signing of both pieces of legislation. Now we get into the extension of the American Canal. The canal, the legislation was pending. The canal, like the park, was under the National Park System. The canal was slated to be under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Reclamation. It was going to be a Bureau of Reclamation project. The officials at the Bureau of Reclamation were they were so positive because LBJ was, they knew this was his deal, and the whole El Paso community was all in support. The leadership had testified on the other legislation, and the Bureau of Reclamation was so positive that the legislation would pass that they spent over $1 million in plans before the legislation moved forward. And in the plans, it's what they found out. It's a 13-mile canal, concrete lined. They found out that if we did this canal, running from up where Hacienda Restaurant was, down past the Zaragoza Bridge, that we knew this ourselves through things that the PSB had done and others. We knew that we would be able, because of the inefficiency of transporting that water through the river, we knew that we would salvage bring back to El Paso about 25,000 acre-feet of new water. That's what that canal means to us, 25,000 acre-feet. Plus, and I don't want to step on any toes here, and I'm going to, but I hope not. But also, some of the farmers over in Mexico would put their pumps in the river and steal the water. I can't use any other word. They get their water through a treaty. We won't get into the treaty, but there was some theft. And I'll talk more about the project later. Anyway, they spent it, they had these studies, they were prepared to go. The problem that we ran into, Senator Fulbright was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. The Vietnam War was really controversial then. I mean, it was at its peak of controversy. And Fulbright was mad at LBJ. And Fulbright was extremely bitter towards LBJ. He killed the legislation. We didn't get it through. Even though they'd spent over $1 million in studies and showed what a benefit it would be, we never got hearings, nothing. Fulbright saw to it that it died. But we got the other two passed. the park and the highway. Now, the good news is that over 20 years later, the canal extension came back. And one of the people that helped it come back is sitting over here. He's taking a nap, I think. Bob Yavara, wake up, man.
I'm awake.
He was official at the International Boundary Commission, the IBWC at that time. What happened? The Riverside Diversion Dam. That was the dam on the other side of the Zaragoza Bridge, and that was the dam that was used to divert the water into the agriculture community. And that in 1987, that dam broke, and the people that are in charge of that, it's the El Paso County Water Improvement District #1. Guy's a member of the El Paso County Water Improvement District #1. I'm going to call it the irrigation district. So you'll know if I say irrigation district, you know what I'm talking about. When the dam broke and they were going to have to replace it, the original legislation that had the reclamation as in charge, and it was under their jurisdiction, called for a local match. In fact, the old legislation that says that any Bureau of Reclamation project requires a 50-50 match. So that meant that the canal, if we'd have gotten it through originally, we'd have to put up 50, and the government puts up 50 of the cost of the canal. So Johnny Stubbs, who is president of that district and is still president of the irrigation district, came to me as a lawyer. I was practicing law then, and part of my practice was handling legislative items in Austin and Washington. And you're going to say, well, he was a lobbyist. I hate that word. You know, I was representing some corporations in Washington and in Austin. And Stubbs came to me and he said, why don't we try to get that canal back on track? We're going to have to spend maybe $2 or $3 million to replace the dam. So rather than spending that money to replace the dam, why don't we get the canal, and then we can just put up our money for the canal, since it's going to have a match. Well, that sounded pretty good, but we had some problems. One, it was under the jurisdiction and then of the Bureau of Reclamation, and who are we going to get to take it on? For years, Bob, I'm sorry, I know you go by Bob now, Bob Yavara and I had talked about trying to figure out some way to get this thing going again. And we met. Commissioner Friedkin had retired. Commissioner Ganaji had not come on board yet. And so anyway, Bob and I came up with the idea that if we could get the IBWC to take it on, then we could go for whole funding from the federal government. So that was the plan. Bob was to go back and talk to his colleagues, which he did, Cruz, and then Ganaji came on board, and Bob gave him briefings, and Commissioner Ganaji came on board. My job was to go back to the Bureau of Reclamation and see if they'd give up the project, #1, and then see if they'd give us those plans. They had over $1 million invested. So the IBWC agreed to take it on, and we went to talk to Gene Hines, who was the district director at that time, and he thought it was a good idea that we let the IBWC let them have jurisdiction. and he gave us those plans. So the next step, this is how I earn my pay. The next step, I went and visited with Senator Benson and Congressman Ron Coleman, and they agreed to handle the legislation. And they did a great job. What we tried to do with the legislation, we tried to get all the funding from the federal government. It had been established then, unofficially, by the IBWC, that the project was going to be like about a $48 million project, a 13-mile concrete canal. And that was our goal, to get the full funding from the feds if we could. Well, we didn't make the goal, but we got the legislation passed, and we got $42 million from the feds, which I thought was pretty good. And the local entity, the irrigation district, agreed to put up $5 million. And I thought that was a good trade. We put up 5 and they put up 42. And I want to say this to you two guys that are here. The IBWC did a wonderful job with that project, as they have with every project that I've ever seen them or been involved with them on. I'd like to compliment them. It's an agency we have here that really doesn't get enough credit. Johnson felt so good, LBJ, about the job they did on the Chamizal settlement, that he designated Commissioner Friedkin a well-deserved title of ambassador. And I'm going to close, I talked too long. It was the greatest community effort where everybody put their politics aside and we worked together. And I give Judson Williams a lot of credit for that, because he brought some of these people to the table that were a little reluctant to come. So thanks for listening to me.
I think that's a great transition. You were working for Judson Williams at the time, so talk about from your perspective, and the city's perspective, what was going on.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here with the distinguished panel, and thank you for coming to discuss a little bit about the Chamizal settlement. The Chamizal Treaty itself represents something that is bigger than, our region. It represents a willingness of two countries to come together and resolve an issue, a land issue, which between countries is very difficult to resolve because of the foreign lands, and to give up parts of your country. But in this instance, there were some basic, fundamental developments that had occurred back 100 years ago in different treaties with Mexico that gave us the legal basis to resolve the Chamizal issue. We had in the Chamizal settlement a win-win situation. And I was very fortunate to be at the right place at the right time as a young, energetic, budding city planner that had the opportunity to work on this project for 8 years of my life. And that was one of my highlights in my career. As we talk, I think the panel is going to agree and disagree on some issues, and we're going to overlap. And one of the many issues is the Franklin Canal, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But in you know, we all know that the Chamizal issue was around for about 100 years before we came to an agreement to erase that issue, that problem between the two countries. In 1962, as we all know, Kennedy and Lopez Mateos met in Mexico City, and they probably had several issues to discuss, but one of them was the settlement of the Chamizal, or not the settlement, but the issue between the two countries. The presidents agreed that they would instruct the respective boundary commissioners to get together and find a solution to the issue once and for all. On the U.S. side, we had, of course, Commissioner Friedkin, Joseph Friedkin, who was an absolute ambassador. He was a gentleman, he was a diplomat, and he was one of the greatest guys that I had ever worked with and met. On the Mexican side, we had Commissioner David Herrera Jordan, Ingeniero David Herrera Jordan, who you had to meet this gentleman, who was also a diplomat, a true gentleman, and a very professional person. And they both got together, and within months, they came back and presented a plan for the resolution of the issue. We all know that the Chamizal, the original Chamizal property, did not go to Mexico. Some of it did, some of it didn't. The problem or the issue on the Chamizal was 437 acres of land that was in dispute. That from the river channel of 1864, 1852, when the river violently changed its course to 1864, those were the 437 acres of land that were left in dispute, because overnight the river channel changed, and some of the property that was Mexico was north of the river. And as we all know, the river was supposed to be the boundary. That is where the whole issue began. Was the boundary the 1852 river channel, or was the boundary the new river channel that was created as a result of the flood? In 1963, as Travis mentioned, the city immediately upon the Chamizal Treaty getting really hot in 1962 and 63, the city of El Paso put together a four-point program ahead of the game, because we knew that the Chamizal program was imminent, that it was going to happen. It certainly, of course, we had both governments to agree to everything that was happening, but as Travis mentioned, there were 4 points. One was adequate compensation for the property owners. That meant that the people that were affected by the Chamizal Treaty, by the new boundary, that lost their property, would get adequate compensation. The other issue was a border highway along the new channel. Now, the original plans did not call for a long border highway. It was really from Sand Street to Cordova Island. That was the original idea of the border highway. Thank God that we took it all the way to Isleta, took it all the way around the mountain, Trans Mountain, back to downtown. That happened subsequently. The third was to establish a Chamizal National Memorial, and that happened with a lot of work, a lot of the proper politics and so forth, and then the relocation of the Franklin Canal, which was one of the issues that were in the 4-point program that the city presented. all of them happened. All of the, President Lyndon Johnson not only embraced the plan, he welcomed the idea of putting all these things in place as part of the Chamizal program, the whole package. The relocation of the Franklin Canal that used to traverse in South El Paso used to take lives of children that used to swim there for years and years and years. We got that done during the Chamizal Treaty. We took the Franklin Canal from South El Paso and put it next to the river for a short distance, let's say from the Hacienda Cafe to basically Copia Street. We got that done. That was done by 1969, 1970. So there was a lot of things that occurred that were very beneficial to the city. We were able to improve enormously the border between the two cities, the border area, by the removal of certain obnoxious heavy industries such as the paint and packing company, stockyards, rendering plants, and all that. And so there were probably 15, 20 major benefits that the city got out of the treaty itself. On the U.S. side, on the Mexican side, the Mexico also got an enormous push in the beautification and revitalization of that area. So as we talk, and I hope we can come back and talk about other, specific issues. But basically, there were a lot of benefits to the city, and I'll just point out a few to you. One is that, of course, we got a new boy high school and vocational school. That was extremely important to us because the Chamizal really shared the old boy and took practically half of the boy campus and so forth. We got above grade bridges across the international line. We were able to separate rail, vehicular, and pedestrian traffic in this area that we're talking about. They used to be at grade. Juarez built a long, beautiful park in what ended up being the old river channel. It's still there, it's being used, it's a beautiful development. And of course, we've got the two national memorials, one on each side. And we've got the irrigation canal relocated, and Juarez got a large sports arena in the Chamizal settlement. And the border highway, as I mentioned before, was a major victory for El Paso and the community. And what can we say? We were able to get a pretty negative land use pattern in this area and transform it into what it is now. So I'll leave it there and we'll come back.
Thanks. Thank you, Nestor. When I introduced Gus earlier, I left off one very important part of his biography. Before coming to El Paso, Gus was the chief ranger at the Lyndon B. National Historic Site in the Hill Country. Is that a national park? National Historical Park. He really brings a lot of deep knowledge about President Johnson in a broader context. And one of the impressive things that he's put together is a photo exhibit at the Chamizal that sort of traces President Johnson, or then Senator Johnson's involvement with Mexican leadership in a way that was really unprecedented for a Senate Majority Leader. Had our government functioned the way it says it should function in civic textbooks, I would be inviting you now to go out in the lobby of the Chamizal to enjoy the photo exhibit. That's not possible right now, but I would encourage you when the Chamizal reopens, which we hope will probably be next week if things go as they now appear, to stop by the Chamizal and look at the presentation that Gus has put together. And with that, Gus, one of the things I think a lot of people may not understand is that Lyndon Johnson had an interest in the Chamizal before other U.S. leaders. So can you talk a little bit about Lyndon Johnson's history with both the Chamizal and the emerging leadership in Mexico?
Yes, thank you for that generous introduction. I wanted to mention how honored I feel to be surrounded by this distinguished panel that lived through this part of history. But one of the things that I really wanted to bring to the forefront, as Mr. Moore pointed out, is the fact that there's a lot of mythology about LBJ, with good reason. Some of it he created himself. He was a masterful politician, and that's one of the things that I think that is overlooked by his many critics at times. Now, believe me, I served over 10 years at Lyndon B. Johnson National Historical Park, and I probably know more about LBJ than I ever wanted to. But the subject is just fascinating. And as I was sharing with the group last night before Dr. Gillette spoke, you know, there's more books that have been published about President Lyndon Johnson than any other U.S. president in history. Now, a lot of people like him. Some people absolutely hate him, and there's everything else in between. But no matter what your point of view is, he is a fascinating and significant character in U.S. history. But it actually extends long before he was the President of the United States. And in this story of Chamizal, that's one of the most important things that people can learn about how this works. Now, I want to use an example that I learned in my research while working at LBJ National Historical Park. You know, after LBJ had pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, some reporters approached him and asked him why, he says, early in your career, you didn't seem to support civil rights. And later, as time changed, you came out in full support of civil rights. And they asked him why the change. And Lyndon Johnson's short answer to that, he was the president then, was free at last, free at last. And then, although he sort of refused to answer the question, but in my research and talking to the people closest to him, especially Lady Bird Johnson, who I got to know later in her life, he had expressed to several of his close friends and colleagues that he understood how government worked. He was the ultimate insider. So he says, when I was a congressman, I represented my district. And when I was a senator, I had to represent the state. But when I was president, I had to make decisions that benefited the entire country. Some would say that that might be a kind of a cop-out. But I'd say that and some historians have blamed LBJ for that. They say that's proof of how political he was. But the other side of that argument becomes that he's still able to accomplish things in the system. Now, you know, one of the arguments that we've heard in more recent history, and I guess when the next presidential election comes up, we'll hear it again. You hear both parties bring it up. And you've heard it, so I'll kind of paraphrase it. We don't want another Washington insider. We want an outsider that's going to bring fresh ideas to Washington and change things. Have y'all heard this before?
Yes.
Okay, every time there's a presidential primary, this comes out. Well, don't have time, and I'm not going to argue the validity of that argument. But the fact is that I think that Lyndon B. Johnson was the ultimate insider. He had served as a secretary to a congressman, got elected to the House of Representatives, got elected to the Senate, became a U.S. Senator. In less than 4 years, he became the Senate Majority Leader. Many historians will argue the most powerful one in history. He served as the Vice President, and then eventually as President of the United States. When he became the President, his style and his approach to legislation and doing things like the Chamizal Treaty were that he knew everyone in Washington, D.C. And if he didn't know you, he was going to get to know you. Okay? So it didn't matter if you were a freshman congressman, he might call you at home. If you didn't answer, he was going to talk to your wife. If she wasn't there, he was going to talk to your kids. He didn't stop. Okay? He was a driven man. And one of the things you'll learn is that throughout his career in Washington, almost 30 years, in all of those positions, his entire life is about politics. This is a man who is so obsessed that he gets up at between 3:30 and 4 a.m. every morning and reads the entire congressional record before he went to work. He suffered from insomnia, type A personality, a workaholic in the highest degree. And as I heard Dr. Gillette speak last night about Lady Bird, the incredible effect she had on him, she definitely is part of that. Not only serving as First Lady, but in her ability to calm him down. In our oral history project at LBJ National Park, I remember speaking to people who had worked on his staff. They said, we dreaded when she was going to be gone from DC. We just dreaded it. He was just a monster. He says, we were worried about it. We wanted to be sick, but then we didn't want to face the consequences of that. She calmed him down. She had that ability to help him. So they had this really unusual relationship. But Dr. Gillette also shed more light on that relationship. He was pointing out last night, for example, some of the things that I had learned through my research as well. That not only did Lady Bird have that influence on him, but that she also helped him a lot. Basically, she was the main person. He helped her develop herself, but it was her monetary inheritance that really established the economic fortunes of the Johnson family. She was the one that ran the LBJ radio stations, the LBJ companies, because LBJ didn't have time for anything else except politics. Okay, and that gives her a lot of credit for her to have come from the point where, for a woman to run a major corporation at that time and to do it so successfully. If you talk to the people who work at the radio station and the TV station, they'll tell you, yeah, LBJ was LBJ, but Mrs. Johnson was our boss. It's that clear. And so that sort of drive, I think, gives you a further insight into what kind of a president he was. What's the result of that? In my theory of the ultimate insider, we end up with a president who in less than 5 years pushes through over 1,000 new federal laws. Wonder how long it would take to do that now. Okay, it's important. It's never happened before in history. It'll probably never happen again. It was a significant time in history. The other thing you should know about Lyndon Johnson, throughout all his career, is that he was driven to do what he intended to do. Now, you probably, those of you that have studied him have learned about the Johnson treatment. And some of that I've already described, where he'll just call you. Okay? The president calling a freshman congressman, I mean, at home, that's kind of an unusual thing. How did Robert Dallek, the president's historian, put it? The telephone was his Excalibur, he said. He loved to talk on the phone. I can imagine if he was alive now, how there would have been 300 channels on a screen, all sorts of staffers keeping up with the latest information. He was famous for the 3 TVs in the living room, so he could keep up with the 3 major news sources. The other thing you should know about LBJ that affects the Chamizal story is that he had learned politics from the ground up. He was the old-time politician. We should remember that. You know, a FDR, New Deal Democrat, like Harry Truman, for example. And in fact, he and Truman have these incredible ties when he's sitting as president. It's President Truman who he brings to sit next to him when he signs Medicare into law, since Truman had failed to do that a number of years before. And then I just want to mention a couple of other things. So if you know that about LBJ, that he's driven, that he's going to get these things done, that he will convince you, call you, threaten you if he has to. And he was well known for using his physical size in an intimidating type of way at times. In fact, to pass the Civil Rights Act, he had to actually have a discussion with his old friend, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, who had been his mentor. And he begged Richard Russell, he says, this is important for the country, we have to pass this law. And Russell told him, no, I'm a Southern segregationist Democrat, I can't do that. And apparently Russell, who was very short in stature, LBJ is 6'4", backed him into a corner, got him to where his nose was almost touching his. And he said to him, according to witnesses then, all right, if you can't support me, I accept that. But if you work against me at all, just understand, you made me Senate Majority Leader, and for that I'll be eternally grateful. But if you try to stop this law, I will destroy you. To his mentor, to his lifelong friend. So, a driven man, okay, with all his positive and negative attributes, who was the President of the United States. The other thing he had learned in his long career in traditional politics was, you know, you've heard the saying many times, all politics is local, right? Even though he was the president, he never forgot about Texas, right? He always went back to the Texas Hill Country. And as I've learned from my distinguished colleagues here, he came back to El Paso many times. Texas issues were important to him, and he never forgot about that. And so the Chamizal issue had been very real for him for a long, long time, long before President Kennedy had met with President Lopez Mateos. So in 1954, you can find him admonishing President Eisenhower, who he had a very positive relationship with, and publicly telling him in front of the media, it's time that we do something to resolve the Chamizal issue. He was very well aware of what was going on while he was still a senator. And so you can bet that when, after President Kennedy met with President Lopez Mateos, that when Mateos had mentioned Chamizal as part of their talks, that President Kennedy would have come back and talked to LBJ. Tell me more about this. What are the issues in mind? So he was, you know, he had this long-term commitment to Mexico. Dr. Gillette also, from his interviews with Lady Bird, mentioned last night how much LBJ loved Mexico. He loved the Latin American relationship, but he, especially as the Texas congressman and senator, had always had a lifelong interest in having positive relationships with Mexico. And he made that real. Two other things I'd like to mention that connect to Chamizal. In 1959, when LBJ was the Senate Majority Leader, he is so powerful in doing that as the Majority Leader that he hosts an official head of state visit by President Lopez Mateos of Mexico to the LBJ ranch. Now that's not supposed to happen, okay? A head of state visit is president to president, but LBJ is not just any other Senate Majority Leader, and so that was approved. He came to the LBJ ranch the exhibit shows photos of President Mateos clowning around with country singer Eddie Arnold's guitar. And so there's some really wonderful photos. So we already had this relationship with President Lopez Mateos as the Chamizal issue began to be resolved by the two ambassadors. And so he and Mateos already had that relationship. Later, of course, when President Dìaz Ordaz was elected, President-elect Dìaz Ordaz also came to the LBJ ranch for an LBJ barbecue. And Dr. Gillette mentioned how they also had had such a long relationship that they were not just friends in an official capacity, but their families were friends and actually spent time together. Johnson spent a lot of time in Mexico. And so when you put all of that together, you begin to see why he would have been in such support of the resolution of the treaty. The national parks. You know, this is a private citizen, that's not just speaking to you. But, you know, LBJ, in his vision of the Great Society, had an idea that he would finish the national park system. So part of his incredible legislative legacy is 63 new national parks established during his presidency, including new kinds of parks. And certainly Chamizal was a new kind of a national park, an urban park, speaking about not where military conflict had taken place, which we'd had parks like that before, but the peaceful settlement of a long dispute between two nations. So Chamizal is significant and part of Lyndon Johnson's legacy. So, of course, we all know that it was President Kennedy's tragic assassination that made Lyndon Johnson the president. But his involvement and dedication to Mexico, to the resolution of the Chamizal issue, and his action, as we can learn from our colleagues here, were all an important factor in this very important part of history. So I'll wrap up with that, and thank you so much.
So Gus talked about how these great global historic figures, President Kennedy, President Lopez Mateos in Mexico, and then President Johnson, and then eventually President Dìaz Ordaz, shaped the settlement. But what gets overlooked in that, the global story is usually told, is that the really, really hard work was done here at the local level. The two presidents met in Mexico City at the height of the Cold War in 1962. President Kennedy is really worried about growing Cuban influence in Mexico and really wants to solidify our relationship with Mexico. And one of the things that President Lopez Mateos immediately comes to is this huge thorn that's been in the side of our country's relationships for a century, and that's the Chamizal border dispute. So President Kennedy commits to doing something about it, returns back, and comes to a man who's been mentioned a couple of times here today, who is arguably the most important figure in this whole saga, and maybe one of the most underappreciated leaders in El Paso's history. And that's Joseph Friedkin, who was the U.S. Commissioner on the International Boundary and Water Commission. And essentially, President Johnson comes back and says, or President Kennedy comes back and says, fix this. And so he turns over the real heavy work to Mr. Friedkin and his counterpart in Mexico, and people like Cruz, who were at the International Boundary and Water Commission at that point, have this huge task in front of them. How do you settle this dispute that will involve relocating hundreds of people or thousands of people, some of the businesses that were discussed earlier. So there's this, once the heads of state reach agreement, the work is really, really just starting. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Cruz.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with this panel. And not long ago, Sally Spinner, who is there, called me to invite me, saying that I was one of the old-timers alive. So I accepted the invitation, and that's what I'm here. in reading the synopsis and editorials of the newspaper, I see that, unless I have missed something, that no reference to the real problem of the Chamizal dispute was mentioned. But this is a problem that originated in the change of the Rio Grande in the earliest, let's say around 1865 or something. There's no definite date because there's no surveys or documentation made and agreed upon by the two sections. Nevertheless, at that time there was no water. The name of the water, it was International Boundary Commission. There was a claim presented by the owner of that piece of land that was affected and that was moved away from the Mexican side as a result of a rapid change in the river. That was Mr. Pedro Garcia. And he put a claim. The original claim came around 1895. And they began working, trying to settle the matter, but to no avail, because the main obstacles was the river changed rapidly or gradually. In those years, the criteria to go by in demarcation of the boundary was the river is the center line of the river is the boundary between the two countries as stated by the original 1847 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But whenever there's a rapid change, the river should go back to where it was before. Unfortunately, there was no documentation in Mexico or even here as to what was the real position of the river when that event happened. Well, they went arguing back and forth as to what was the first, that was the center of discussion. Was it by rapid movement or slow movement? That was one case. Well, nevertheless, as a result of this, the commission, meaning the US commissioner, Mexican commissioner, submitted the case for arbitration. In all these writings and synopses, there is no reference to this arbitration. The arbitration of 1911, which one of the commissioners, I don't know the title, if it was a commissioner, Lafleur from Canada, he ruled in favor of Mexico. And this is where the real Chamizal problem and dispute began. There are so many things about the benefits. Yes, we know about the benefits that brought the settlement of the Chamizal problem. But the real solution to the Chamizal problem was to relocate the river so that Mexico will gain or transfer back to Mexico 437 acres, which was estimated to be the land under dispute. Well, when Mr. Lafleur ruled in favor of Mexico, the United States did not accept that ruling, claiming that the commission was supposed to say yes or no, I mean, on the land, on the case. But Mr. Lafleur, or Commissioner Lafleur, I don't know what the title, ruled that about 2/3 of that land in dispute belonged to Mexico. That was another point of argument for the United States, saying you were not supposed to divide the land under dispute, and that's why they never accepted. Well, this went on for many years. Unfortunately, in the Mexican side, if you know the dates, 1911, 1910, Mexican Revolution, and problems thereafter for several years, so no action was taken by Mexico. But in 1925, after the Mexican Revolution, Mexico wanted to take the case to an international court. And that's why the two countries, the two presidents agreed to try to settle the problem diplomatically. And since then, efforts were made. 1925, according to the records, most of the presidents, US presidents, approached Mexico to settle the problem, because this was, as you said before, a thorn that was bad for the image and the relationship of US with the rest of the world. And then comes the what do you call, the meeting between the two presidents. But let me say something here that this is unofficial. I mean, it's not in the records. But when the two presidents, Kennedy and Lopez Mateos, met in Mexico City, they had a very, very vivid and sincere conversation. As a result of this, we learned that Mr. Lopez Mateos, in his dissertation at the University of Mexico City, his dissertation was on this subject, Chamizal settlement. So he was an attorney, a lawyer. So he knew the legal problems in addition to the technical problems. And that's when the two were very enthusiastic, and the Mexican president agreed to give instructions to the commissioner, US Commissioner, Mr. Fricken, and Lopez Mateos to Commissioner David Herrera Jordan. Right after that meeting in Mexico City, Commissioner Fricken came to us. I was working at that time, I had only about, let's see, not even 4 or 5 years with them. And he came and began working immediately on trying to settle the problem. Commissioner Fricken always, during that period, consulted and kept informed the local authorities, municipal, county, state, and whoever. As a matter of fact, Commissioner Fricken, in meeting with Bowie High School ex-alumna or alumna, they objected. He said, in trying to settle this problem, be sure that the relocated river will not go, the Bowie High School will not go to Mexico. And believe me, this is one case that we have to draw many options and alternatives, and always try to go around Bowie High so that that piece of land will not go to Mexico. That's what it made it, a little technically trying to have a straight river, avoid the meandering, and at the same time to have it relocated straight. Well, these cases went on, and Commissioner Fricken, every time that he went to Mexico City, he would take the exhibits where we were working. In those years, the computers, as we have them now, were not available. So we used to draw the lines and planimeter. We were planimetering and coming up. What we were trying to do is to come up with the specified acreage, which was 437. Apparently that acreage was 2/3 of the entire land that Mexico was claiming, but they settled for that. And what else? There's a lot to talk on this, but nevertheless, they began doing the presentations. The Commissioner Fricken would go back and forth, and every time that he would come back, he was trying to give credit to all the employees, and he would say, your exhibits, these exhibits, were in the hands of President Kennedy and President Lopez Mateos. This is something that he always gave us that credit. Well, as a, let me see, the settlement really, when it came about, it was to return. There is no such a thing that the main objective was to straighten the river. No. The rectification project had occurred already in 1933. So there was no reason from the lower end of Cordova Island to Fort Whitman, the river was meandering about 155 miles. And the rectification project eliminated that meandering and straightened the river from the lower end of the so-called Cordova Island to Fort Whitman. 155 miles were reduced to about 85. This is what one fact. Now, and there are so many things, but I don't want to take so much of the time in here. If there's more questions or clarifications, I'll be glad to say and talk. But there was an important issue. So in all those alternatives and options, trying to respect what Mr. Fricken wanted as a result of his meeting with the ex-alumna or alumna from Bowie High, said, do not give away this piece of land. So we always have to go around, okay? Another thing is that this is important. There's misconceptions. The Cordova Island was the result of a flood that occurred in 1895 or something like that. And to avoid damages because there were people from the Mexican side living in the Cordova Island, the so-called Cordova Island. There was a flood, and in order to avoid going through that curve of the river, meandering the river, they cut artificially the upper end and arranged it to go through a short cut instead of going through there. And by no means Cordova Island was not in dispute with this Chamizal. There's no such a, they've been confusing the issue, saying that Cordova Island was part of the settlement. No, part of the land that belonged to Mexico was sure taken, but that was under no dispute. Well, I think that's enough for now. And we'll go.
So I think Cruz gave us some very important historical context there, so thank you very much. And I think that really sort of set the stage for how we got to that period in 1962, 1963 when we were trying to work it out. Travis indicated in his remarks that the community leadership was very unified in the approach to this. But as Cruz just alluded to with the mention of the Bowie alumni, there were people with vested interests in this issue, and so it wasn't like all of El Paso agreed on the path, or all of Juarez agreed on the path to settling this. There really were some things to be worked out, and it took some really masterful diplomacy to kind of bring all of these various people together. And with that, I set the stage for Sam to talk a little bit about what he witnessed back when this was being settled. Sam?
I'll speak rather briefly. First of all, my fellow historian here, Nick Hauser, and I find ourselves just like the man at the end of an irrigation ditch. That we sometimes run out of both time and money. I'd like to also acknowledge the presence in our audience of our youngest historian, here in the second row. Can you have her wave to the audience? Yeah, there we are. Thank you, dear, for your presence. And first of all, Nick and I will be talking about a time when Lyndon Johnson was not president. This is the early part of the 20th century, the latter part of the 19th century. We have to regard the Chamizal, particularly the arbitration of 1911, as taking place in a very, very unusual time. In May of 1911, from May 8th to May 11th, the Battle of Juarez broke out right across here. I mean, loud, dynamite, machine guns, Pancho Villa, Madero forces, a significant federal force over there, all within sight and sound of El Paso. Now, who arrives right after this is just winding up, but the Arbitration Commission, added to by a Canadian jurist, to have an arbitration, international arbitration. Can you imagine such a thing? And here you're trying to settle river boundary changing, and here you've got all this noise on the other side. Well, it's virtually impossible. To show you the importance that the El Paso Times paid to the arrival of several of the significant participants in the 1911 arbitration, their arrival was mentioned on page 8 of the Times, right under an article concerning a local bicycle theft. The commission had its works cut out for it, and as Cruz pointed out, as in many arbitrations, the arbitrator split the difference, although the terms of the arbitration was you got one tract of land. Who owns it? And so the presiding commissioner, the Canadian jurist, with the reluctant joinder of the Mexican commissioner, said, okay, we'll split it. Well, that left General Anson Mills, our commissioner, with the unenviable task of saying we can't follow the decision in an international arbitration because it didn't meet the terms of submission. Now, that was the legal reason. As the practical reason that he perhaps said we really can't do business at this time is that before the Arbitration Commission concluded its work in May of 1911 and issued this decision dividing the tract, the Porfirio Dìaz government in Mexico had collapsed. And Porfirio Dìaz got in a ship and went to Paris, where he lived the rest of his days. So here General Mills had a country, well, who's in charge here? There wasn't anybody in charge. In fact, there wasn't anybody in charge for quite a few years. And as had been pointed out earlier, things just kind of went on and on and on. Now, prior to the 1911 arbitration, international arbitration between countries had a good popularity. In other words, as a alternative to war. Let's arbitrate. And there were a lot of international arbitrations. Theodore Roosevelt arbitrated the end of the Russo-Japanese War, for instance. But with World War I, subsequent wars and like that, international arbitration has almost gone away from our scene. So if you're going to take one thing away from the early history of the Chamizal and the arbitration, let's give everybody back there involved a break. You were trying to do something in the most difficult of times, and the fact that it was a so-called failed arbitration, let's not kick them around about that. Now, an interesting sidelight is that the Mexican representatives at the international arbitration were all Porfirio Dìaz appointees. By the end of the month, with the Porfirio Dìaz government gone, they certainly were not going to walk back across the bridge to Juarez. They'd probably be shot. So several of the leading members went to Europe, some went to New York City, but none of them went back. None of them went back. So that's just kind of a little sidelight. I'll conclude my remarks with arbitration in river boundaries, just like common walls between neighbors here in the city. They're nothing but trouble. From your argument with your neighbor to the argument like the Chamizal, it's always there and it's always going to be with us. Now, even though you've been down to the Chamizal National Memorial, by the way, don't rush down today. It's closed. But please, take it upon yourself. It's a lovely setting. It's beautifully run, outstanding exhibits. It's quiet. Go down there again sometime. Thank you all for coming today.
Nick Hauser has done a lot of work on various parts of Southwestern history, with a lot of focus lately on Benito Juarez and his role in Mexico and in developing this region. So, Nick, I noticed you nodding a lot when we're making the points there with Mr. Moore. Do you want to kind of pick up on the sort of the broader historical context there?
Yeah, okay. I guess I'll start from kind of a personal point of view, going back to when I was in my mid-20s, like some of you have mentioned, when you were young. I was a student at the University of Arizona in anthropology. I came originally from Portland, Oregon. The reason I went to University of Arizona to study anthropology was, I hate to admit, was really related to the climate, because it rained so much in Portland. And I wanted to go to a place that was nice and dry and sunny and warm. And I met with the staff at at Portland State College in Oregon. And they asked me if I'd selected a school for graduate school. And I said yes. And I was scared because I didn't want to tell them what the reason was. And they said, what school? And I said, University of Arizona. They said, excellent, excellent. Okay, great. I'd considered Albuquerque, but I looked at the climate charts, it got cold in the winter. Anyway, I went to University of Arizona, and I learned quite a lot there. It was really good for me. However, one late spring day, and the professor was giving his lecture, he said, would someone be interested in doing research this summer in a community, Indian community, that we know very little about? It's in El Paso. But you should know some Spanish. Well, I knew a little Spanish, not a lot. I thought, well, there'll be 7 or 8 students after class and they'll be interested in going to El Paso. I didn't really want to go back where I worked every summer, sometimes double shifts in the paper mill, smelly paper mill, but I made quite a lot of money at the time. So I was the only student, and I was amazed. And so they got me a little grant, and then I got another grant through Rio Bravo. And I drove in my little car to El Paso. And guess who I met when I got here? Tom Diamond. Your friend, right? A lot of you know Tom Diamond. And he was a lawyer. He's in his 90s, and he's bright as ever. Very intelligent, good person. And he took me down to Isleta, to the Tewa Indians, and I lived in a little house, 4-room adobe with about 8 people. And they gave me one room, and some of the kids had to sleep in the kitchen on the floor. They were incredible in terms of hospitality. Well, I started doing research, and one of the things that the tribe was interested, of course, getting recognized, was getting their land grant back. They told me that they had a lot of land there called the Isleta Grant. So I started doing research, especially in deeds. I went through at least 20,000 or more deeds. Tom Diamond said, don't go to deed indexes, just go to each book, like 20-some, 30 books. And so that's what I started to do. And then one day I was visiting him and his wife in their home in El Paso on the west side, and the phone rang. Tom picked it up, was talking to someone on the phone. Then he said, Nick, this man has questions that I can't answer. And I think you'll probably be knowledgeable because you've been working on the land grant and the tribe and all this, for at least a month or so. So this must have been in July or so when this happened. So he said, it's the White House calling. I said, what? The store? What are we talking about? No, it's the White House, Washington, D.C. Oh my God, I'm 20-some years old and my hand's shaky. I pick up the phone and I'm talking to Bill Moyers, who was press secretary. And he asked me a number of questions about the tribe and if they'd been recognized before, if they'd served as Indian scouts with the U.S. Army and the Texas Rangers. So that's great. So I answered the questions, and that's my only association with LBJ. And I think I had another call maybe a week later from him. But anyway, he was very helpful in helping the tribe, and he and LBJ, and helping the tribe get recognized, okay? So that was interesting. When I started looking at deeds and what have you, and looking at the history of the area, I realized I just couldn't look at Isleta. I had to look at the entire community, non-Indians. Some of the folks were Chinese or Asian people, some were from the Middle East, blah, 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 that had farms and were in the area. You know, they were all over. And also I was interested, because I found out from doing my research, I knew nothing about El Paso until I got there, that the native people, when Oñate came here in 1598, were the Manzos and Suma Indians, okay? So I got kind of interested in that. I didn't really know much. And I thought, well, every time I have a free day, maybe on a Saturday or Sunday, I'll go over to Juarez and I'll go to the old partidos, the old districts that go way back, and I'll ask these people in my broken Spanish a couple of questions. And it went like this. I'm sorry, but it wasn't very good. But it was, perdóname, señor, señora, usted ha oído de la gente indígena que vivieron aquí hace muchos años, blah, blah, blah. And they would look, you know, they were nice and polite, and so I'm like, what is this crazy gringo, you know, asking these questions? A lot of them, some people say, I'm from Durango, I don't know anything. Or they'd be very polite and walk away and sort of shake their head smiling. This got to be embarrassing and difficult. And I did it for maybe 12, 15 days or so. I was getting absolutely nowhere. I left the area where the old Guadalupe mission is, that's the Manzo mission, and I went to San Lorenzo, okay? And I saw an old man. Anyone old to me was at least 50, you know, I'm in my 20s. And he's sipping a refresco on a bench, on a banco there in the plaza. And I went up to him and did my, perdóname, señor, usted ha oído, blah, blah, blah. And he stood up and he said, I'm Manzo Indian, and I'm in Spanish, I'm Manzo Indian and I'm proud of it. I about fell over, I couldn't believe it. And then his name was Natividad Camargo. His son is Cruz Camargo, who lives here in the San Elizario area today, and is a really good person. Unfortunately, his father passed away in his 80s or so, but it was incredible. And he took me over to the Manzo Indian descendants that lived in La Colonia de San Jose, which is called El Pueblito. And I met them. They're very nice, they're very helpful, and they started talking to me. And I was amazed because, you know what they told me? They said, some of our people lived in the Chamizal. I said, what? And yes, they lived in the Chamizal near the river. And Natividad Camargo said, we lived in the Banco de Camargo. Our family did, named after us, Manzo Indians, just a little bit upriver from where the Chamizal is. In fact, it adjoined the Chamizal. Well, this is interesting. I really didn't know anything about the Chamizal. At the time, 1966, I heard stuff that I paid no attention to, and that was that there was some kind of a basketball team at UTEP, and they were winning, and I don't know, I could care less, you know, I wasn't into sports, just, you know, didn't pay any attention to it. And so I started thinking, well, this is interesting. Chamizal, I don't know anything about it. Then I heard on the news something about Chamizal and a land dispute or something. Didn't pay any attention to it. I was focusing on Isleta at the time. But it was really interesting because then gradually my mind began to, you know, open up and started thinking, gosh, the Chamizal, I don't know anything about it. And then later I did historical research. Well, almost the same time, I guess, but later I did a lot of historical research. And I looked at some of the Boundary Commission reports and interviews from, what, 1897, I believe. You know, there were a series of them. And one of the men, I think in 1897, his name was Carino Lara. And he was at the meeting of the Boundary Commissioners about the land dispute. And he provided some information, and he's reported in the document as being the governor of the Indians. First I didn't quite understand what that was, and then I realized, oh my God, he's a Manzo Indian governor. And he said he was born in the area let me see, I'm trying to think what area he was born in. Right next to, in San Lorenzo. And no, he was in the Chamizal area, and then he moved to San Lorenzo, that was it. Oh, anyway, he talked about the fact that they had land in the area, and then they had floods. And if you look at the history of the Rio Grande, it's capricious, it's unpredictable, you never know what it's going to do. And it would come down, you know, and often in the spring, who knows, sometimes even in the fall, and big floods would take place. And sometimes these floods took place way up north, you know, in New Mexico, and further up, Colorado, and the river would become swollen and, you know, and come down surging. And sometimes it would just be a heavy inundation of rains, or in the Las Cruces, El Paso area, and there'd be a lot of damage. But, I mean, the river did good things. It brought in what? It brought in water, I mean, obviously. And during the floods, it brought in a little more water, and over the banks, though it was flooded. And there were areas that were called wetlands or bosques, and that was great for hunters and game, birds, and what have you. And the Manzo and Suma Indians lived along the river, and they took advantage of that. They did their hunting and what have you, and the Manzos had some agriculture, the Sumas did, and the Sumas were more Apache-like than the Manzos. The Manzos were a Pueblo people, and they even had clans that were very similar to those in New Mexico. And anyway, I became aware that the Chamizal was an area where the Manzos and Sumas had been. And interesting, Nestor called me the other day and told me about what happened in the San Elizario area, whereby back in 1896 or thereabouts, the Boundary Commission met, and people were upset because in the San Elizario area, where there was a bosque, I think it was called Urucan, I believe it was called, a big sandbar, a big area with wetlands. The river didn't have much respect for the United States in that area. It started to flood in on our soil rather than the other way. The other way was always, you know, going into Mexico. And so they lost some land, at least the people in San Elizario. The river started to come in cut in on the U.S. bank. So anyway, some of the commissioners from the United States suggested, oh, let's have a land exchange here to, you know, resolve this settlement with the Chamizal. Let's let the Chamizal lands. Let me see. They could go to those disputed lands could be part of the United States. No problem. They already are. Blah blah blah. You know, they're on our side of the river, and then. We'll do an exchange. We'll give Mexico the lands that are down in San Elizario, where the river, you know, invaded, U.S. territory, and we'll do this as a settlement. Well, Mexico wasn't too hot about it. The reason was that San Elizario was kind of a area of bosques and what have you, not a large population. Whereas the Chamizal was considered a very important district or of Ciudad Juarez, or a VP of the Ciudad Juarez. So anyway, that never happened. But anyway, I don't want to ramble on and on here, but it was interesting. I started looking at census records from Ciudad Juarez and Paso del Norte, and there's the Chamizal again popping up, and there's people, Indian people, Manzo mainly. They identify as Manzos, and the leaders are recognized. The cacique, the chief, is recognized, and the name is Lara. And there's Roy Ball, also governor and what have you. So anyway, there was an Indian population there, and that's often not known. And well, what else is there to say? I think that's about it. What else? We talked about.
Actually, Dick, I think we're sort of over time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's it, because I just wanted to mention what my background with the Native Americans in the area and the history. Thank you.
We'll have two people talking about two very distinct but interrelated facets of communication. Our first speaker will be Dr. David Lowry, who is the pastor at First Baptist Church here in El Paso. And as you'll hear from him, there is a deep family tie with the Baines family to First Baptist Church. And in the program, Adair has included just a wonderful quote from President Johnson's daughter, Linda, about her ancestor who came through El Paso. So we'll start with Dr. Lowry, and he'll trace the Baines family and the importance they played, not just in El Paso, but throughout Texas, particularly with the Baptist Church. And when you think back to 1882 and what El Paso was like, I think to be a Baptist preacher in El Paso would have required persuasive skills of the first magnitude. So we'll hear from Dr. Lowry on that, and then afterwards we'll hear from Dr. Pat Witherspoon, who's the Dean of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at El Paso, and I'll give her a separate introduction before she comes up. But I'd like to begin by inviting Dr. Lowry to come on up.
Thank you, Bob. Good to see all of you here this morning. I want to thank Adair for the invitation and the Tom Lee Institute. Tom Lee was a member of First Baptist Church, so we consider him one of our heroes, and we are excited about the difference he made with his life, and his legacy continues. And today we're going to talk about Lyndon Baines Johnson. Whenever my mom used my middle name, I was usually in trouble. I'd done something terribly wrong, my sins had been found out, and so when she called out David Lawrence Lowry Jr., I better get there as fast as I could and make up a story as fast as I could make it up. Well, Lyndon Baines Johnson bore his middle name with honor, because the Baines part of his family name, I think, is one of the streams that made him as the great leader that he was and the difference he made in the world. And so he claimed both the Johnson side of his family and the Baines side of his family. The Baines side of his family is traced back to Rebecca Baines, which was his mom. And she was raised in a family that was very Baptist. In fact, her grandfather was a rather famous Texas Baptist legend. His name was George Washington Baines. And George Washington Baines actually began ministry following his father's example, because his father, Thomas Baines, was also a Baptist preacher, but happened to be a Baptist preacher in North Carolina. And so you can see in President Johnson's lineage, there were two Baptist preachers directly in line, and then he had an uncle, George W. Baines Jr., who happened to be the pastor of the First Baptist Church of El Paso when it began in 1882. And so you can see this line of Baptists. But George Washington Baines probably was that bigger-than-life character within the family that I'm confident that Rebecca knew a great deal about. In fact, I'll give you two anecdotes from his life. In 1854, he happened to be riding a horse by the home of Sam Houston, or General Sam Houston. And Sam Houston's wife, Margaret, had been working on the old general for years to convince him to choose to be a Christian. And not just a Christian, but to be a Baptist. And anyway, she was relentless. She prayed, she pleaded, she worked him over. Well, finally one afternoon, the old general agreed that he would become a Baptist. But he didn't want to get baptized. And so Margaret, as circumstance would be, looked out the window, and George Washington Baines was riding by their home on a horse. Well, he had been her pastor, so she stepped on the porch, called out to George Washington Baines, and invited him up to the house and told him the situation. The old general was considering being baptized. Would you change your plans and spend the night with us? Well, George Washington Baines agreed to do that. They spent the night together, talking, debating, as you might imagine. The next morning, he was heading to Brenham, and so Sam Houston traveled with him to Brenham, and by the time they arrived, the general had agreed to be baptized. Anyway, the baptism was scheduled. There were actually three famous Baptist preachers that were there. Rufus Burleson was actually the one chosen to do the baptism. They took him out to the normal place where they baptized, and unfortunately some boys had gotten out there and sort of messed up the scene. And so they had to take him out to the Rocky Creek. And when they gathered there, Rufus Burleson took him out into the water. And as he was stepping into the water, he noticed that the general had his pocket watch. And so he said, "Sir, you'll probably want to hand your pocket watch off." And then he noticed he also had his billfold. He said, "Well, sir, you probably want to give your billfold." And the old general said, "Pastor, I think my billfold needs to be baptized just like I do." And so he actually was baptized with his billfold there in the river in front of a rather large crowd who were shocked to hear that this big old drunk, as he had been known, was now a follower of the Lord Jesus and a part of that local church. When he came up out of the water, it was rather cold that day, and they say that when he came out of the water, some of the guys were saying to him, "Well, what a wonderful day. All your sins have been washed away." And he said, "I sure do feel sorry for those fish." Well, that was 1854, George Washington Baines. Well, then in 1861, right in the early days of the Civil War, Baylor University, which was established in 1845, one of the oldest universities in Texas, was going through a crisis. They were debating in those days whether or not women should be allowed to participate in the university. As Baptists are known, it was quite a heated debate and quickly divided. And so George Washington Baines was named president of Baylor University. And part of the reason he was named president, because he took the stand that women ought to have the opportunity to receive a college education. So he stood firm. Baylor University, not only did they educate women, but down the road from them, they established Mary Hardin Baylor University, which was an institution for many years that focused primarily on women. But all of that's traced back to George Washington Baines in 1854 and 1861. Well, that's the great-great-grandfather of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Well, anyway, he had 10 children, and one of his sons was George W. Baines Jr. And in 1882, George W. Baines Jr. moved to El Paso. As was already alluded to, if you don't remember our history here in our city, 1881, 1882 was when the citizens of this sleepy little village began to hear the sounds of the railroad heading to town. And it wasn't just one line that was heading here. It was tracks from the north and from the south and from the east and from the west. And suddenly this sleepy little town that had been nothing more than a just small village on the border between two nations became a boom town. Thousands of people began to move here. It was the center of commerce and transportation. And if you were to ask a Baptist, it was the center of sin. In fact, it was known affectionately as Sin City in those days. If you walk the streets that we'll be walking going back to our cars, this neighborhood was known for brothels, saloons, places of gambling. It was known for gunfights and gunslingers. It was called the six-shooter capital of Texas. And so George Baines Jr., at the age of 32 years old, as his father was dying, in fact, his father died in 1882, he moved to El Paso with the dream of planting a Baptist church in the city. When he arrived here, there was just a handful of Baptists, and they met in the home of a major out at Fort Bliss. There was about a dozen of them that met there, and they began to dream the dream of having a Baptist church. And now, some 131 years later, in pretty much the same neighborhood, the First Baptist Church of El Paso exists. As I think about George W. Baines Jr., I think he took on the same characteristics of his father, which was that willingness to take on challenges that were far bigger than anyone was willing to take on, to do what some would think would be impossible, but to do it because he believed it was the right thing to do. You see, one of the things you have to understand about Baptists, particularly Baptist preachers, is that our role is far different than many of our fellow pastors and denominations. Every single Baptist church is autonomous and independent, which means there's not a Baptist church in the world that reports to any other Baptist church or institution. Every one of our churches are autonomous and independent. Now, when they call us as pastors, they say that they call us, but the reality is that we are elected as pastors of the church. You see, Baptist churches are congregational rule, they're democracies. And so when a pastor's called, the church votes whether they want this pastor or not. And so in order to become the pastor of a Baptist church, essentially you're elected. You also serve at the will of the people. Any bad business meeting, and I'm out on the street and I don't have a job. because at any point a Baptist pastor could be fired if for whatever reason the congregation deems that he's no longer fit to serve. And so Baptist pastors are elected and they serve at the will of the people. And so any Baptist pastor that's effective is not only a pastor and a preacher, and I'll use this in the best sense, he has to be a politician, because he works within a constituency, within a group of people that he has to be able to move and to influence. You see, Baptists do not lead by authority. I cannot call some headquarters somewhere and get marching orders and then tell my church, this is what they told us we're supposed to do. There's no place for me to call. And so if I'm able to lead my congregation, it's because I can cast a vision and influence them to follow that vision to accomplish the mission that we do together. And so I think part of that heritage probably played a role in the development of President Johnson. His mother was raised in that kind of reality. She knew very well the realities of what it took to influence people, to bring about change. She had seen it in the life of her grandfather, in the life of her extended family. I'm confident she passed some of that on to President Johnson. Now, you probably are aware that he wasn't an active Baptist. He was a man of faith, but he was not known for for that being part of his story. But I think there are some things that I suspect came into his life through the Baines family. Let me just suggest 3 things. One of the things that I see in both George Washington Baines and George W. Baines Jr., and probably in Rebecca, was a commitment to visionary, courageous leadership. In other words, to do things that were important and to be courageous in doing it, to take risk, to not play it safe, not to sit in the shadows, not to wait for someone else to take the initiative, but to be the ones that would move first. George Washington Baines, to my knowledge, started over a dozen churches, both in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. President of Baylor University at a very critical time. Held a number of posts within Baptist life and oftentimes found himself in unpopular positions, but doing what he believed in his heart was the right thing to do. George Washington Baines, George W. Baines Jr., as you've already noted, moved to El Paso when this would have been the last place in the world most people would have ever wanted to come. They did it because they believed in their heart it was the right thing to do, and someone had to go first. As you think about President Johnson, obviously there are many that love him, many that have concerns about his leadership and decisions that he made, but there's one thing that could be said for him. He was decisive, he led, and he actually left our nation much better than he found it. The civil rights legislation that he brought through has made America a much better place. That wasn't an easy thing to do for a man from the South, and yet he did it with courage. I think it was part of the Baines legacy in his life. The other thing that you see in these 2 Baptist pastors was the ability to articulate a vision, to put it in words, to put it in images so people could understand what they were talking about. In 1882 on San Antonio Street, not far from here, when that small gathering of Baptists began to dream about a church being planted here, George Baines Jr. picked Genesis chapter 28, the story of Jacob, for his first text. If you don't know the story, it was the night where Jacob fell asleep and had a dream of a gateway or a stairway to heaven. At the end of the dream, he awakens and he confesses that he didn't realize where he was. He says, I am in the house of God, and this is the gate to heaven. Now, if you put it in the context in which he was speaking, what he was suggesting was Sin City, this booming town with all kinds of darkness and evil, was actually the house of God. That God was going to show up in this city, and that this was going to be the gate to heaven. You see, he planted a very powerful image in the minds of the people that followed him, that God was up to something big, and that God would make this dream become reality. I don't know if he ever dreamed 131 years later that that church he started would still be going. But I believe that God knew that, and that dream was planted deep in his heart, and he communicated in a way that people could see it, touch it, and believe it. And then the final thing was, as you saw in the conversation between Sam Houston and George Washington Baines, and what in the story I'm about to tell you about George W. Baines Jr., Part of leadership is being willing to go eye to eye, face to face, heart to heart, and to talk about serious matters in serious ways in order that decisions can be accomplished. If you're going to be a leader in the world that we're in today, then instead of making your point through the press, instead of trying to use these images of the people and sort of tear them down or build them up, if you really want to make a difference, you're going to make a much greater difference if you'll actually talk directly to the people you're trying to influence and the people you're trying to understand. Sam Houston and George Washington Baines must have had an incredible conversation. Can you imagine trying to convince that old general who had held so many places of leadership and influence in the world to convince him to humble himself and be baptized? I would have loved to have heard that conversation, but you see, it was between the two of them. We don't even know for sure what they talked about, but what we do know is the old general decided to do what he believed was right. In terms of George W. Baines Jr., one of the first things he had to do here was to build what he called a house. There was no place of worship in the city, and they really weren't comfortable doing it in saloons and bars. And so he knew that they had to build a house here, but there was no money. Sounds like my church today. Well, anyway, so he began to try to raise money. He sent out letters to all of his friends asking them to help. In a letter that he wrote to his family, he confessed, "So far, I have not received $1 in response to the many letters that I've written." But then he adds, but I have done well in soliciting money via voice. Translation, when I talked to someone face to face and I told them of the need and I asked them to help me, they did. You see, that's leadership. I'm not opposed to sending letters, but I know that a letter can never carry the force of a personal relationship. In fact, he goes on, I like this particular quote at the end of the letter. He says, "I am sure I'm growing godlike in this one respect anyhow. God loves a cheerful giver, and so do I." Sounds like a good Baptist to me. And so the things that I would hope that you take home with you from the Baines legacy is this, that in our president, you found a man that was courageous and willing to face challenges when others weren't. You found a president that was willing to put into words and visions what he believed needed to be done. But most of all, you found a president that was willing to have those conversations that had to happen. I only wish that he was alive today so we could send him to Washington.
Thank you, Dr. Lowry. And as we hear from our next speaker, I would invite you to keep in mind Dr. Lowry's conclusion about the value of face-to-face communication as a persuasive technique. I suspect this is going to come up again. And I don't know if it's genetic, but there's probably a very strong argument that some of the skills that our next speaker is going to talk about certainly came through that Baines lineage. Our next speaker today is Dr. Pat Witherspoon, who is the Dean of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at El Paso. I first got to know Pat when she came here in something of a time of crisis at UTEP. The communications department was struggling to find its way and to find a mission that would best serve the student population. And I was really thrilled when she came out just to do an assessment, because I found out that her expertise was in presidential communication, which is something that I've had a passion about for a long time. And I don't think you can talk about the history of presidential communication and presidential persuasion without starting with Lyndon Johnson. He's not what you would see today. He was not a master of television. He didn't always give a great teleprompter speech, but I think because of what Dr. Lowry alluded to and the sort of the power of one-on-one persuasion, Lyndon Johnson was just an absolute master of that. And so Dr. Witherspoon's going to talk about several examples in some of the key legislation that our earlier panel referred to when you look at the president's accomplishments, Medicare, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act,
starting Head Start, starting programs like the Job Corps. Really just a tremendous legacy that in this time of gridlock is frankly hard to imagine. But it's not so hard to imagine when you hear how President Johnson accomplished that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Witherspoon.
Bring the microphone down a bit. Thank you, Bob. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Adair Margot for this wonderful celebration of Tom Lee all month long, and certainly for this part of the celebration. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson, of course, announced he was not going to run for re-election. But that was the year he also proclaimed National Hispanic Heritage Week. And it's possible that that pronouncement had its roots in the Great Society. At least activist Kenneth Burt has observed that Johnson appointed a record number of Latinos to oversee the programs in the War on Poverty, that he directed millions of dollars into existing programs like Project SER, the Center for Employment Training, and the Mexican American Opportunity Foundation in California. We know that Johnson taught Hispanic students before beginning his political career, and in 1948, Spanish surname voters gave him the winning majority that paved his way to Congress. So I agree with what Bob said earlier today about where that support came from. President Johnson, as we know, was in El Paso on September 25th of 1964 to unveil the new boundary marker between Mexico and the United States with President Lopez Mateos, which of course was the culmination of the Chamizal Treaty and a testament to decades of negotiation and collaboration between two nations. Then he left here in late September, and a few weeks later he won the American presidency in his own right with that landslide victory over Barry Goldwater. So 1964 was really a great year for him personally. Prior to his trip to El Paso, it had been an astounding year for his legislative agenda, a year where his gifts as a persuader were significant and sustained. Now, several years ago, I wrote an article in an academic journal suggesting that Lyndon Johnson really initiated his presidency in late November of 1963, within the first few days of entering the White House. He had, as vice president, an ambitious legislative agenda, and he wrote in his autobiography that to enact that agenda, he needed a national consensus. And that consensus, he wrote, had to be accomplished before John Kennedy was buried. Now that seems like an astounding comment and perhaps insensitive, but Lyndon Johnson had patterned his politics after Franklin Roosevelt, as we heard earlier, and Sam Rayburn, and the nation's needs, he was convinced, had to be met with the most ambitious agenda since the New Deal. And he had thought for a number of years that he was the best person to lead the enactment of that agenda. Well, by 9:30 p.m. on Friday evening, November 22nd, 1963, we probably all remember that day, the files of John F. Kennedy had been sealed in the Oval Office, and they were awaiting removal. We're talking 9:30 at night, and he was killed Austin time, Dallas time, pronounced dead around 1 p.m. Back from Dallas, President Johnson went to his vice presidential office in the Executive Office Building, and he initiated his presidency by starting to make phone calls, we've heard about the phone, and arranging meetings with strategically chosen people. He first called President Eisenhower and asked him to come to Washington from Gettysburg to provide some advice and counsel on when he should speak to the nation and what he ought to say. He called Everett Dirksen, Senator Everett Dirksen, who was a Republican and Senate Minority Leader, and then he called Democratic Speaker of the House, John McCormick. And he didn't call them just to be courteous. They were legislative leaders, and he would need their help in the weeks and months to come to help pass his legislative package. Dirksen from Illinois was instrumental in getting the Civil Rights Act passed with support of some Republicans. The next day, Saturday, November 23rd, Johnson started a 2-week process of talking with leaders from every sector of American society. Labor leaders, corporate magnates, the most powerful members of Congress, and every major African-American leader to discuss civil rights legislation. Thank you. So he was calling all of these leaders. Now the calls were very clear reminders that an American president was on duty, that the president was on top of things, and that the transition from one president to another had taken place. And he called the people that were so central to his legislative agenda. On the afternoon, we're talking 24 hours after President Kennedy was shot, he had made the decision to speak to Congress on Wednesday, November 27th, the day before Thanksgiving, rather than speak directly to the nation from the Oval Office. Why? Because Congress passes legislation, the public doesn't. And he was of the Congress, as we heard earlier today. A congressman, then a senator, then the vice president, head of the Senate. The nation, of course, was unaware of much of this presidential activity, and so was the press. Publicly, we were, of course, mourning a fallen leader. Privately, a series of meetings and phone calls were going on that were executing the presidential transition. Between Sunday, November 24th and November 27th, Wednesday, Johnson's speech evolved from a eulogy to an inspirational message to a brief outline of what would become his legislative package. We were watching, of course, the continual coverage of the aftermath of the legislation, of the assassination, the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald, and the nation's tribute to President Kennedy on Monday in both Washington and Arlington Cemetery. Now, President Johnson attended all of those ceremonial events, and then he spent time in meetings, face-to-face sessions, and on the phone, working with a very small window of opportunity to craft a statement about the future of this society. Many people, Kennedy staffers, Johnson aides, contributed ideas to this speech that he would give on November 27th. But the main authors he chose were Ted Sorensen, who was President Kennedy's alter ego, John Kenneth Galbraith, Hubert Humphrey, McGeorge Bundy, Bill Moyers, and Horace Busby. The latter two were Texans whom he trusted. Now the speech became a political message to Congress, or as I sometimes call it, an inspirational message with teeth. Many people made many suggestions, and it's interesting to know what he decided to put in the speech, because there are several drafts and I compared them. The federal aid to higher education, courtesy of Humphrey, who would become his running mate, was in the speech. Civil rights, courtesy of Abe Fortas, whom he would name to the Supreme Court. And the speech emphasized the importance of Speaker McCormick, because Johnson needed the top person in the House of Representatives to feel needed and important, and because Speaker McCormick was next in line if something were to happen to President Johnson. And a partner in getting these bills passed, of course, McCormick became that partner. And McCormick, of course, was a Bostonian Democrat and a close friend of the family, of the Kennedy family. Now, as I mentioned, there are several drafts of this speech. It's interesting to note what got left out of the final draft. First, a request for a moment of silent prayer was left out of the speech. A phrase emphasizing that Johnson's coming into the Oval Office would mean no change of purpose or policy. A couple of paragraphs describing America as a good society were left out because a few months later Johnson was going to talk about what would create a great society. The words liberal and conservative were left out. Also left out was a phrase saying there would be no changes to the budget. Why? Because by January, about a month later, Johnson had cut the defense budget, increased the budgets for health and medical research, urban housing, education, and an anti-poverty bill. He was encouraged by several people not to mention civil rights at all. In the speech, he articulated his commitment to civil rights legislation, and 8 months later, the Civil Rights Act was passed. If you read the final version of this speech, which of course was a message to the rest of the nation and the world, you don't see a ceremonial speech, you don't see an inspirational message or a State of the Union address. It is an inaugural address. He didn't get an inauguration, of course, under these circumstances, but that's what his speech sounded like. It launched his presidency, and not because he was insensitive to where the nation was and what had happened to this country. Indeed, the first few minutes of the speech were a tribute to President Kennedy and his dreams as articulated in Kennedy's inaugural address, conquering space, creating a Peace Corps, providing education and equal rights to all citizens. Kennedy's ideas and ideals he emphasized had to be turned into action. Johnson was very sensitive, as we've heard, to the needs of this country, especially those in areas of the country and our state who had financial, educational, and health needs. A month later, he would declare war on poverty. Now, several times in the speech, Johnson told Congress he needed their help. He said, "It's up to us not to hesitate, not to pause, not to turn our back and linger over this evil moment, but to continue on our course to fulfill our destiny." The first time he smiles in that speech was when he recalled that for 32 years, Capitol Hill had been his home. And then he called for the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Several of his advisors, as I mentioned, urged him not to bring the topic up, but he did. And he reminded the audience that he had urged them in 1957 and in 1960 to pass that legislation. Johnson would later say that this part of his speech would set him apart from the South forever. His persuasive strategy was twofold: to mention civil rights and to give his position on it. This set the stage for his focus for the first 6 months of 1964. He called for action, emphasized that he, the nation, and the Congress had to resolve that John Kennedy had not died in vain, and that teaching and preaching hate and evil and violence had to be put to an end, which fit his commitment to civil rights legislation. He spoke 25 minutes and was interrupted 34 times for applause. Now, the speech was very well received. We were obviously in an environment where people wanted to want this president. Sad, but hopeful that we had someone to carry us through this time of sorrow. The mail that came in was negative only about the focus on civil rights. Dick Gregory, African-American comedian and activist, said, "As soon as Lyndon Johnson finished his speech before Congress, 20 million of us unpacked." As an ongoing reminder of his goals and his plans, Johnson gave bound copies of this speech to members of his cabinet for Christmas. Within 12 weeks, the Civil Rights Act had passed the House of Representatives, and bills providing aid to higher education and mass transportation and poverty programs were moving through committees where they had previously been trapped. Now, speech scholars have never given Johnson much credit as a public speaker, as we heard earlier. And that's ironic to me because he had so much preparation and practice in his previous political roles. But this speech, along with countless phone calls and meetings, launched the presidency, and it was a perfect example of persuasion as a political process. In the making of the president in 1964, Theodore White wrote that Johnson's performance in the early days of his presidency was superb because he did not let Congress or his cabinet take leadership away from him. In the middle of January, White wrote, "The presidency of the United States was Lyndon Johnson's presidency, brilliantly and effectively conducted." I think that presidency was Lyndon Johnson's by the end of November 1963, because he was committed to an agenda that he had been developing for years. Now, for the first 6 months of 1964, the telephone was one of Lyndon Johnson's greatest tools, as we've heard. And he would call people anytime, day or night, for as long as he felt he needed to talk to them, because, again, he's focused on this legislative agenda. And by the way, he got back to the White House from Dallas on November 22nd, around 6:37, and by midnight, he was already complaining about the White House telephone service. They didn't have much time to get used to a new president. I've listened to a number of phone conversations during the first months of his presidency, and his communication style was continuously persuasive. And I'm going to show you with a few examples. His communication style was always urgent, questioning, controlled, and aggressive. He would call someone, ask a question, and then interrupt them while they were answering the question, which is kind of an interesting thing to listen to. Now, research has taught us that people who interrupt others frequently and continuously are asserting their status over the other person. Johnson also used tones that were sometimes angry, sometimes cajoling, and as a longtime debater and teacher of debate, he was the master of using these potent phrases to make his point, which I'll give an example of in a minute. He used tone, reasoning, data, all the means of persuasion available to him. Now, when you read these excerpts or snippets of Johnson's phone conversations, the reading only gives us a flavor of these communications as persuasion. You have to hear them, really, in Lyndon Johnson's voice to appreciate this master politician and a master legislative strategist. But here's some examples. On November 29th, this is 2 days after he talked to the nation, and 6 days after the president was killed, 7 days, he told Philip Randolph, a civil rights leader, "Don't quote me. If the president gets in the paper, we'll destroy everything we've done. Be prepared to talk to every single Republican and to ask if you are for civil rights or not." On November 30th, he called Robert Anderson, a Texas businessman and a confidant of his. "Say to the Republicans, now you're either for civil rights or you're not. You're either the party of Lincoln or you ain't. And by God, put up or shut up. This is it." Now, I apologize, the use of the Lord's name in vain. You understand this is President Johnson. But this is as bad as it's going to get. He started counting votes in both houses of Congress for or against the Civil Rights Act on on December the 3rd. On that day, he asked Congressman Carl Albert, House Majority Leader, "Can't we make a poll of our own and determine which House members are for us and against us?" And he, upset that he couldn't get hearings scheduled on the bill, he lamented, "We can't have a standstill, do-nothing government." On the same day, he called J.W. Fulbright of Arkansas, who chaired the committee which was giving the bill its hearing, but it had not yet done so. The president opened the conversation by saying, "You have anything to talk to me about? I have some things to talk to you about," which was the strategy to get the hearings on the bill. On January 6th, he told Eugene McCarthy, which I find very ironic considering in 1968 how McCarthy and Johnson would be so much opposed to each other. And of course, McCarthy especially over the war. But this was 1964, 4 years earlier. He told Senator McCarthy, "Pull together the Democrats, make them attend the meetings, make them keep their mouths shut, make them vote down that amendment, and get me a bill out on that floor. You really work on that. For God's sake, don't let this thing linger around." On February 10, Jack Brooks, congressman from Texas, called to tell the president that the House had passed the Civil Rights Act 290 to 130, with 4 Texas congressmen voting for it. 10 minutes later, Johnson talked with Carl Albert saying, and he's talking about the mail that he'd been getting, "They may take me out. The telegrams were awful." Obviously, he was having death threats. In the next 3 months, Johnson spent time arm twisting, as one congressman said, being sure that no other bills stymied the progress of the Civil Rights Act in the Senate, including a major farm bill. So on February 19th, he called the Secretary of Agriculture, Orville Freeman, and said, "Get your report written if you have to work all night." During April, and of course Johnson is in primaries, but he's unopposed, so he's not necessarily going out and campaigning a lot, but he is going out and doing some campaigning. But during April, he was jousting with members of his own party who were concerned about watered-down amendments being placed on the Civil Rights Act, or they were opposed to the bill. In other words, they were either more liberal than the president or they were opposed. So Senator Wayne Morse told the AP, the Associated Press, that if Johnson allowed crippling amendments to be attached to the bill, quote, "You'll find me battling with a guy named Lyndon Johnson." Well, that guy Lyndon Johnson called Morse, read him the quote from AP, and said, "I don't need any warning." On April 10th, he called Senator Robert Byrd, Democrat, who was against the Civil Rights Act. "I'm not going to argue with you about that bill. I know how you feel about that bill, and I expect you to vote against it. Of course, I might send you off on a tour or something some of these days before they vote." Well, he didn't, but anyway. By May 13th, he was concerned about recalcitrant Southern senators and Republicans. He told Senator Dirksen of Illinois, "Get the folks together and let's do the job. I want this to be an American bill, not a Democratic bill. The man from the land of Lincoln, Dirksen, is going to pass the bill. And he used that phrase many times over the 6 months. Being from the land of Lincoln, being from the party of Lincoln, what's the matter with you? You know, not wanting to vote for this bill. Senator Carl Munt, Republican from South Dakota, was aware of Johnson as a persuader and told him on June 9th in a phone conversation, "I appreciate that you didn't call and give me the old Texas twist." To which the president replied, "I haven't called a human being. I do talk to my friends now and then." Johnson talked to House Minority Leader Republican Charles Halleck on June 22nd, we're getting close now to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, urging actions actually on multiple bills, and that's what was really interesting. He was, at the same time he was pushing on civil rights, there were several other bills he wanted to get through, including an anti-poverty bill, and he was pushing everybody all the time on all these bills. So Halleck, feeling pressure, says, "You want the civil rights bill through, you wanted the tax bill through, and I helped you do it. I helped Kennedy and I helped you." To which Johnson responds, "Then you help yourself." Of course, you all want civil rights as much as we do. I believe it's a nonpartisan bill. I don't think it's a Johnson bill. And Halleck replies, "No, no, 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 no. You're going to get all the political advantage." 8 days later, the House agreed to a Senate amendment. The bill passed 289 to 126, and it had passed the Senate on June 19th, 73 to 27. Now, the scheduling of the bill signing was also rhetorical. The Civil Rights Act of '64 was signed on July 2nd, 2 days before we celebrated American independence. And because July 4th was on a weekend, they didn't want to sign on the weekend, okay? Because there's not a TV audience out there. They're dispersed. The president signed before a national television audience at 6:45 p.m. Eastern Time, after briefly addressing the nation in the East Room. Several of the African American leaders he had first called on November 22nd, or those he had called were in the room with him at the time. By 7:22, he was in the Oval Office with Robert Kennedy, a couple of his aides, and the civil rights leaders. By 1 a.m. July 3rd, he was in Texas at the LBJ Ranch, which one day, of course, would become his refuge from a world which quickly forgot the achievements of 1964 and focused on events halfway around the world. About this evening, Lady Bird wrote in her autobiography that John Kennedy's civil rights bill had come to pass because of the earnest, dogged work and the legislative expertise of Lyndon. That expertise was firmly grounded in his ability to persuade. Mrs. Johnson also wrote that as she went to sleep in the hill country of Texas that night, this was one of those rare nights, starry in every way, when one does not think about tomorrow. Thank you.
It's been a wonderful day so far, just quite an amazing learning journey for me anyhow, and I hope that all of you have had a similar experience. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our final speaker of the today, who is both a mentor and a friend. I had an interesting academic journey. Out of high school, I was probably the world's worst student, and after 4.5 years, I managed to get myself kicked out of an open enrollment institution in Colorado for poor academic performance. Unfortunately, I'd fallen into a love of journalism before I managed to abort my academic career. But once I established myself in El Paso, I went back to the University of Texas at El Paso as one of those non-traditional students that UTEP really specializes in training. So I was there from my mid to late 30s, and as I was finishing my degree, this wonderful new force comes to the university to head the African American Studies program at UTEP, and it was really something that had been missing from the curriculum for a long time at UTEP, and indeed I think in the community here, a lack of understanding of the really vital role that African Americans had played in the development of El Paso and the Southwest was really missing. So in walks Dr. Maceo Daly and really brings a new level of understanding to these critical issues, and I had the good fortune to take one course with him right at the end of my time at UTEP, and he really, just in that one course, taught me so much about what true scholarship is, but more importantly, what it is to be very passionate about the subject matter that you're mastering. So today we're privileged to have Dr. Daly here to talk about not only President Johnson, but also really probably the most influential political figure to ever come out of El Paso. And I'll let Dr. Daly explain a little bit more about Ewing Thomason. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with him, and of course we used to have Thomason Hospital named for him. But he's really the only person from El Paso who achieved statewide political status, and is really truly a transformative figure for our community, but also had this tremendous relationship with Lyndon Johnson. They were contemporaries in Congress during the New Deal at this really vital time in our history. So I'm very happy today to have Dr. Daly talk about the relationship between Ewing Thomason and Lyndon Johnson. So with that, I give you Dr. Maceo Daly.
Thanks, Bob, very much for those very kind words. You were a brilliant student, so what more can we say? It's really quite an honor and pleasure to be here, and many of the things I'm trying to squeeze into a brief presentation have been touched upon, so perhaps I can shorten it somewhat, and we can dialogue perhaps more significantly. I was delighted to hear much talk about the Baptists. I come from a long line of Baptist believers and preachers, and the best advice I got from one of my Baptist forebears is that if you're giving a lecture to a group of Catholics, make sure there's one door, one way out. If you're giving it to a group of Methodists, make sure that there are two doors. If you're giving it to a group of Baptists, make sure there are two doors and that you're near one of those doors. So I will try to remember that as I move forward. One of the things about the issue of civil rights, and you may ask, why start with this extraordinary man, Frederick Douglass? He was a man of the people, if you will. He taught himself how to read and write, became one of the most extraordinary users of the English language in the 19th century, probably only matched by Malcolm X in the last century, but the capacity to think metaphorically and really put his finger on what the issues are, unsurpassed. And here, of course, Douglass notes that there is hope for people when their laws are just. I think it's one thing that we all could remember as we move forward. And here are two men, fascinating, and I came to them in part because I read one or two passages from each that stimulated my interest. Let me read you the one that was most fascinating about Lyndon Johnson. He said at one point in trying to convince a young acolyte, quote, "It's not the job of a politician to go around saying principled things." And I thought, well, this is a man of power, and so if that serves his purpose. But with respect to Johnson, in the mid-1950s, he interviewed one of his African-American, or perhaps more accurately, a discussion with one of his African-American employees, Gene Williams. And he talked to Gene Williams about what it meant to be black in the American society, what the problems were, the difficulty in taking Johnson's car from Texas to Washington, and segregation, unable to find hotels, decent places to eat. And after Johnson walked away from that discussion, he said this: "The day I first realized the sad truth that Negroes were in prison, so was I." wonderful observation. And earlier this morning, someone said, when Johnson had to talk about this, he said, free at last, free at last. But here is empathy with the community. And it was a comment that piqued my own interest, because when we look at the formative years of Johnson, there's nothing there that would suggest that he would be remarkably empathetic with African Americans. And of course, many would suggest that by the late 1950s, he opportunistically thought that he had a chance to become president. He needed a cause. He found the cause in civil rights and moved forward. And that is, of course, true. But at the same token, I think that when we recognize that he was a man of power, and one of the things that he said in his quest for power and in bringing about change within a community, he said to African Americans on one occasion, we should not be preoccupied with changing the laws. We should be preoccupied with changing the people who make the laws. And that might be a more significant change. With Judge Robert Ewing Thomason, in many ways, we need a new biography on Thomason, a modern biography which would encapsulate all that he did. Many of you probably know more about Thomason from interaction, but in some ways, I found him to be quiet and unassuming with a lot of the information he had. On the other hand, my distinguished friend and colleague Sam Moore told me that he was a consummate politician, always seemingly running for office. And so you do have the two sides of the man. However, Thomason was very clear about the power of Lyndon Johnson, his prominence, what he was capable of doing. And when you read, for example, the Cairo biography called Master of the Senate, this is terminology that Thomason used many, many years before that, in 1968. And so what I was trying to do is to figure out who are these two men and their political careers. And I think we know the story of LBJ fairly well. He really became an ambitious politician when he worked for the National Youth Administration, and he coordinated all the activities in Texas. He was able to move from there to congressman in 1937, senator in 1948, vice president in 1960, and president in 1963. In the Senate, he served as the majority whip. Parenthetically, Lady Bird said the 12 years, the most, the happiest ones in their lives in terms of Lyndon Johnson and her own career. With Robert Ewing Thomason, here too is a man of extraordinary ability and accomplishment. Elected to the Texas legislature in 1917, mayor of El Paso in 1927, House of Representatives from 1931 to 1947, judge of the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Texas from 1947 to 1963. The work that he did here in El Paso, he's credited with the airport, helping the military, Fort Biggs, the airport there. And as chairman of the Committee for Military Affairs, here was a man who recognized the ways that one could bring resources to the state of Texas. And over the years, I'm going to have to, can you hear me if I stand here? Okay. I may have to move here so I can see what I have here. This is LBJ's quote. I do understand power. Whatever else may be said about me, I know where to look for it and how to use it. Ewing Thomason, know my shortcomings, but I hope above everything else that I have a sense of justice. I pledge the balance of my days to helping adjudicate fairly cases of civil rights that come before me. And this is 1948. Their connection, and Adair wrote about it in Sunday's newspaper. Ewing Thomas was one of those wise counselors to whom Lyndon always looked. Lyndon's father used to tell him, son, if you ever are uncertain about what to do, just notice what Ewing Thomason does and just follow right along behind him. And of course, Johnson does. When I note that they are consummate politicians, this was an ad that Ewing Thomason ran when he was running for re-election, and I love the title, Vote for a Friend. You don't have to think about one's political posture or position, but vote for a friend. With LBJ, this is what Bobby Baker, Senate Democratic Secretary, stated. On his own, Johnson closely studied every senator, his background, his family, his hobbies, his drinking habits, his womanizing, among some. He seemed to sense each man's individual price and the commodity he preferred as coin. Very powerful statement. What I tried to do was to take a historical concept that we've used for several years and to interpret the relationship between the two men. You might say, well, this is a kind of egghead, nutty thing that a professor does, but what does this mean in the context of the two men? But if you were to think of the so-called founding fathers and how they coalesced as a group, passed a constitution, what I wanted to look at within the relationship of the two men, and of course later the Texas delegation, is how men of a similar class status, education, and political points of view come together to effect change within society. Is it narrow interests, fair play, concern for democracy? And then the other thing I appended to it was, when is it that people break ranks with the community in which they live to move in a different way, believing that they can shape that community and bring others into the fold? And I think that, admittedly, we would have to say that was part of LBJ's genius. This is a Texas delegation, and here we have Thomason, Sam Rayburn. Sam Rayburn coordinated these activities every week, where the Texas delegation would meet in his home or another place, and they would talk about what were the paramount issues in front of them, how they planned to bring about change, how they could work effectively as a unit. And so to be a part of this organization clearly meant that you knew what the issues were. It was also a way of homogenizing the group, but also to get the group to work effectively as a unit. The other thing about the two men, Thomason and Johnson, is that they were New Dealers. They were both very fond of FDR. There are letters and correspondence between the two men in which Thomason laments that people here in El Paso are anti-New Deal, anti-Roosevelt, and he hopes that something can be done to bring change about. And of course, we all know that LBJ was a New Dealer. The other thing that I tried to factor in, the many times that LBJ came to El Paso, and I don't know if you can read that, but the paper says, well, Democratic landslide stuns Ike. And this is 1958. And of course, LBJ is almost gloating. But if I recall correctly, the Republicans lost about 40-some seats in the House of Representatives, and 12 in the Senate. Another critical moment when LBJ is here in El Paso is with JFK. And of course they are campaigning, but it's a wonderful picture. But it places LBJ here in El Paso, and of course with his dear friend Ewing Thomas. And this was a photo that Bob Moore found and forwarded to us of LBJ in El Paso, and he takes it upon himself to stop the motorcade, go into an area predominantly African American, interact with the African American community. And certainly in the 1960s, the early 60s, we applaud LBJ for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But I really think the rehearsal was in the 50s with the Civil Rights Bill of 1957. And that in many ways, by the time we get to the 1960s, LBJ has had a rehearsal and he knows how to deal with those matters. These are other situations where LBJ is in El Paso. You recognize Mesa Street. But let me go back to the 1950s. One of the things that LBJ noted when he was trying to cajole people or scare them into addressing some form of civil rights was to alert them to this Baptist preacher who had these wonderful oratorical skills and may be smart enough to bring the African American community together to effect the change that many Southern Republicans were Southern Democrats were apprehensive about implementing. And of course, Dr. King was doing under the concept of the social gospel that frightened many blacks, particularly black ministers, because he was demanding that one should go outside the church and that the church should be engaged in the burning issues of the time, civil rights and moral issues and so forth. So rather than allowing those black churches to be insulated, what Dr. King proposed and what made him somewhat a thorn to many black preachers is that he was urging them to use their resources to bring about change within the community. But I won't go through all of them. They're wonderful. There is an intellectual foundation for this, and I would argue that it's the great black scholar who graduated from Harvard with the PhD in the 1890s, W.E.B. Du Bois, his legendary comment, the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. There is Mary Bethune in terms of galvanizing black women as an educator. This is Ella Baker. She's extremely significant because many of the young kids who were in SNCC and a bit later the Black Panther Party provided leadership by Ella Baker. She was the one who counseled them and forged them into a unit to think about how young kids could be involved in social change. And when you look at people like John Lewis and others today who are in Congress, they note Ella Baker and her role. This is 1957, and it's a moment that allows us to think about what LBJ saw, what he had to deal with, but it's also a case of Elizabeth Eckford, who's trying to integrate Little Rock High School. She shows up late, and when she gets there late, she runs into a mob and a crowd, really waiting for the other black students who had been removed by that time. But there were, I had some fear about this.
Until 1954, segregation laws in some states forbade black students from attending the same schools as white students. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court outlawed segregation throughout the country, and ordered that white-only schools must be open to African-American students with all deliberate speed. The governor of the state of Arkansas vowed to defy the order. "Blood will run in the streets if Negro pupils should attempt to enter Central High School," he said. The school board of the city of Little Rock, Arkansas planned otherwise. To comply with the Supreme Court order, the school board of the city of Little Rock announced that the city's all-white secondary school could now accept black students. On the first day of school in September 1957, 9 African-American children, later referred to as the Little Rock Nine, planned to enroll in Little Rock Central High School. Elizabeth Eckford was one of the 9. The Little Rock School Board asked parents of the 9 students not to accompany their children to school because the board feared that the presence of African-American parents would incite a mob. The governor of Arkansas sent the National Guard into Little Rock, claiming that there was a danger of violence. Arrangements were made for all 9 students to meet off campus and approach the school accompanied by a lawyer and under
difficulty of using technology. It has to be done from the back.
Yeah.
military protection. Because the Eckford family had no telephone, Elizabeth was unaware of the arrangements, so she set out alone. When she got off the bus near Central High School, Elizabeth saw a crowd of angry white people and hundreds of armed soldiers whom the governor had sent to prevent the 9 students from entering the school. Elizabeth thought she might be safe if she walked behind the Arkansas soldiers to the school entrance. Believing the guards were present to protect her, she tried to pass through the line several times before being forced back into the white crowd.
The crowd began to follow.
Well, I don't think it's going to work. Perhaps I can complete it by narration. She's heckled, intimidated, and she tries to go back to the bus stop. And the crowd is standing around and they're jeering, and Elizabeth Eckford really fears for her life. And all of a sudden, there's a lone white female who comes out of the audience and will walk to the bench and comfort her, and then take her to the bus. That lady, subsequently we found out, is a lady named Grace Lloyd, and her husband taught at a historically black college. And for me, it was a very courageous act for the white female to do. And the question was, well, why? What are the sensibilities? What kind of ethos where this person had gone first to witness and perhaps even to participate with the mob, or the crowd, if you will. But all of a sudden, when she gets the images there, she's transformed into someone who's trying to protect and help Elizabeth in that situation. And that started me to thinking about, well, what are the things that inspired Judge Thomason, along with LBJ, to break ranks with the American South and move forward to promote the kind of legislation that Johnson did a bit later, and something that Thomason pondered. And what I think it was for Judge Thomason, first and foremost, was after after World War II, when Eisenhower was in Europe and he saw the horrors of the concentration camp, Eisenhower felt that people could not believe the horror, or would not believe the horror. A poll taken by Americans at that point said generally that most Americans thought 100,000 Jews had been killed during the period of World War II. And so what Eisenhower asked for a group to come to Europe and Germany in particular to look at the concentration camps. And Ewing Thomason leads the delegation. Let me see if I can find. Yeah, here is the congressional delegation, equally divided between HR members and those in the Senate. And when they go to several of the horrific Nazi concentration camps and they witness the horrors, I don't know if you can read that, but this is a statement that Ewing Thomason introduced into Congress called German Atrocities. And he carefully documents the history, the problems, what Jews experienced in those concentration camps. And when he got to the end, there is a rather ennobling statement about humankind, the respect that we must have for one another, and what we should think about as we move forward. And I think that this is a pivotal moment in his thinking about civil rights, apropos the quote that was shown earlier, in which he stated he would spend his time fighting for justice and for civil rights. I think this moment in time certainly had an impact on his thinking. And here are some of the issues that one had to deal with here in Texas and in other places. These signs, no dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans allowed. And so what then would I argue would be the path to civil rights for Ewing Thomason? I'm not going to argue that he was aware of particularly the two books, but they are instrumental in shaping American attitudes. Clearly, the New Deal. There are questions about the role of blacks within the nation, issue of parity, civil rights, and so forth. But during World War II, as the Nazi machine is exercising its might within Germany, there's a Carnegie-sponsored project by Gunnar Myrdal called The American Dilemma. And Myrdal wrote about all aspects of the African-American community. It's a book much like the Bible, so big, we all know about it, but few have read it. But this was a book that many had to read in graduate school and so forth. And Myrdal said two things in the book, basically, an enormous amount of research. But he felt that African Americans were too concentrated on the East Coast, so they needed to be moved to different states where they would represent 10% of the population of that state. And then he also said, significantly, that most Americans were troubled by their hypocrisy, the bigotry. And if they had an opportunity to change or to revisit that, they possibly would. There's a second book in the 1940s by my own mentor at Howard University, Rachel Logan, What the Negro Wants. And this was a book of approximately about 20 essays by the ranking black leaders in the African American community, Du Bois, Wilkins of the NAACP, Mary Bethune. All of them wrote about an agenda for the black community in the 1940s. The book was submitted to the University of North Carolina Press, and W.T. Couch, who was the editor and the Southern sympathizer, read the book, and he said, well, if this is what you Negroes want, you better think again, because you're not going to get it. And it is true that we asked you to write the book, but we're not going to publish it. And Dr. Logan threatened a lawsuit, and consequently, the book was published. So we have an agenda. But I think more significantly for Thomason and LBJ, related to Texas, here in El Paso, in the 1920s, Dr. Lawrence Nixon launched two cases that ultimately ended up in the American Supreme Court, challenging the right of blacks to, making it possible for blacks to vote in the all-white Democratic, formerly the all-white Democratic primary. And Texas found ways of circumventing the case, although he won in both instances in the American American Supreme Court. But what Dr. Nixon was fighting for would be the right of black Americans to participate in Democratic primaries, and that would lead to making them a force. The bill really comes into fruition, in the most part, in a Supreme Court case 20 years later, Smith versus Allwright in 1944, in which blacks are allowed to participate more fully in the Democratic Party. And I can't, although I don't find anything in the documents related to Nixon or Smith versus Allwright, meaning the papers of Ewing-Thomason and LBJ, it's difficult to think that they could have missed those significant court cases. And one puzzling aspect to me here in El Paso is that the papers of Dr. Nixon are in the LBJ library. And I've asked the relatives of Dr. Nixon, did they know or meet LBJ, or did they know Ewing-Thomason? No, they did not. And we still can't explain how those papers were donated, but in 1967, we do see Dr. Nixon's wife signing them over to the LBJ. But I think they're very important because it would suggest to me that there must have been some connection. And if there is that connection, then it would mean that both Ewing-Thomason and Johnson would be much more apprised of the civil rights movement. I'm going to run through these quickly, but does anyone recognize this photo, by the way? And this is one thing that really angered Johnson's colleagues, because this is the Capitol Gallery, and this is a place called the Taj Mahal, which is what Johnson created to reflect the luxury and its redesign. And they started to call it the Emperor's Room. At the same time, they were referring to him as a leader. This is Dr. Nixon, about whom I talked earlier. Extraordinary man. We are in need, I think, of another biography of him. But with Dr. Nixon, with Ewing-Thomason, when he becomes a federal judge, in 1954, Thelma White graduated from the lone black educational institution here in El Paso, Douglas School. And she was, by all accounts, a wonderful student. She applied for entry into Texas Western College and was denied. In July 1955, when the case is to be adjudicated by Judge Thomason, the attorneys for Texas Western College argued that in the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling in 1954, that there was no need for a ruling in this case that Texas Western would be open to African Americans. But what Ewing-Thomas was concerned about is that it be done immediately. And so the court cases in July of 1955, and Ewing-Thomason ruled that Texas Western College has to be open immediately in September of 1955. I would note that the attorneys for the NAACP who pressed the case, one led by Thurgood Marshall and a black businessman in Dallas named A. Maceo Smith, but the NAACP attorney who argued the case, a man named U.S. Tate, I just can't find anything on him, but he is the one who makes it clear to Judge Thomason that what Thelma White wants is the immediate opportunity to enroll in Texas Western. This is the Texas Western newspaper, the initial 12 black students who enrolled in 1955. Interestingly, when we look at their academic careers, one of the things we find is that for the most part, they were given low grades in the subjects of math, English, history. But in gymnasium and music. They were given incredibly high grades, A's and B's. And of course, that tells us something about the stereotyping of those particular students. This was referenced this morning. Of course, what happens when those students come in, they really struggle academically, but athletically, we can see where it's going. And of course, the championship team in 1966, 50 years after Texas Western was integrated, we invited the 12 students back. I have photos of some of them to talk about their experiences at UTEP. And they were cognizant of the fact that they were getting low grades in the heavy subjects, and in music and so forth. They were getting high grades, and so they were faced with this kind of bigotry on campus. But for the most part, they really applauded the opportunity to be here at Texas Western, now UTEP. And they're holding up books and pamphlets, things that they read during this period. So what am I trying to note here? The two men, Thomason and LBJ, were very close. You read both the letters in the UTEP Special Collections Library, along with the LBJ records, and you find that they're writing, they're communicating. Ewing Thomason was quite happy and pleased with the progress that LBJ has made. I'm speculating that we must have some occasions where they talk about the matter of civil rights and change and transformation. We must remember that the case to integrate Texas Western College occurs in 1955, the Little Rock situation. 1957, LBJ is pushing the Civil Rights Bill of 1957. And LBJ knows that he's up against a formidable group of Southern senators who are not going to embrace it. So what he does is he weakens the bill somewhat. He promises Southern congressmen in the Democratic Party that, and he's using a surfeit of the N-word, that we've got to give, I'll say, African Americans something, or we're not going to get out of here. He makes that argument clearly. But then at the same time, what he's preoccupied with in that bill is voting rights, because he says, in effect, we want to be able to change the men who make the laws, rather than dealing with the laws immediately. If you change the men, the legislatures, you will get what you want. The other thing that LBJ holds out to the African American community, he says, in effect, this is a start, and if we can pass one civil rights bill, then we can pass other civil rights bills. Obviously, 1964, 1965. But he still had some opposition from the African American community. And one of the persons who stands out for most of us is Jackie Robinson, the baseball player. And Robinson's viewpoint was that the 57 bill was not enough, that one should ask for much more in terms of integrating of different Southern institutions. But A-Phil Randolph is in the same category. The larger African American community is supporting the Civil Rights Bill of 1957. And there's a coalition of 16, if you will, civil rights groups, but they include unions, Jewish organizations, and they embrace the bill. But what I think makes that moment, 1957, so critical is that it's a rehearsal for what happens a bit later. And I also suspect that Ewing Thomason played a larger role in the thinking of LBJ. It remains to be documented. I had some other photos I wanted to show you, but I too am a victim of the shutdown government. I waited until about 2 weeks, although I went this summer. I think we were in the airport together in Austin, there. And I had identified the photos, but I forgot. And about 2 weeks before the shutdown, I mailed. Hopefully they'll get here. But I think we really need to, one, I would hope, maybe at UTEP, convince someone to do a modern biography on Thompson. And I think also one that would look at the relationship within this framework of prosopography. It would tell us much about what went on behind the scenes, certain discussion about civil rights, and how those individuals were ultimately impacted by such a name as LBJ, Thomason, Sam Rayburn. How do we get this great paradigm shift in the history of the country? So that's it. Perhaps I can deal with any questions or observations or threats.
I have a question about this African American students in Texas Western College. So it was almost a consistent policy among the professors they had in the academic subjects to give them low grades, or were their previous education not prepared them?
Well, that's a great question. I want to note one or two things before addressing it directly. When African American communities sent black students to all-white, formerly all-white institutions, they sent the creme de la creme. They were individuals who were generally very smart, exceptionally well trained. One could go on and on about that because the black community felt that it wanted to put the best foot forward. So it's really troubling to think that when those students got to UTEP or Texas Western College, that their grades were very low. There are 3 African American women, and they do very well, meaning that they are B students. But when you look at the males, 1 or 2 actually flopped out, and they came from very prominent families. One of the men on the slide was a man named Marcellus Fulmore. His brother was so brilliant that the brother wrote a book on Douglas High School, and later on went off to University of Chicago to become a journalist major. The book is absolutely brilliant. It's difficult to think that a high school student would be able to do that kind of quality writing. But when you look at their report cards, they are getting low grades in the tough subjects, and in the so-called easy ones, they're getting high grades.
But I don't think, do you think it was part of the professors who were deliberately maybe being unusually rigorous with their work? Or
well, that's an interesting word, unusually rigorous.
Yes, well, I want to be nice.
That's kind of, I think it was a matter of stereotyping and bigotry.
Yeah, okay, that's
and
right.
also not wanting the students
to be there or to succeed.
Yeah. And many of, well, 1 or 2 of them were discouraged and later on came back to get degrees. But why don't we jump to another period, because we just had this discussion during the homecoming when we invited back black alumni. One of the things that the athletes noted is that even with this team in 1966, that when it won the championship, that somehow a discussion emerged on campus that, okay, you've done this, but don't think you can come back to UTEP and date, or Texas Western, you can date white women. And then there's another debate about how 5 black ball players started that particular game. And so it's very interesting. I think what we have to recognize, and racism is a very ugly word, but I often tell my students, if you don't talk about what ails you, how do you expect to find a cure? And so I think we've spent a lot of time sweeping things under the rug, rather than recognizing and perhaps even being somewhat forgiving in the sense that many of these individuals are men and women of the times in which they lived. And yet some of them did rise to the occasion and others did not. But I think we have to find the forces and the mechanisms that enable them to make that leap of faith. With Ewing Thomason, I think the major point is the visit of concentration camps, because the horrors he described are just mind-boggling, but he did it in a very judicious way, no hyperbole at all. And it's also clear when he rules in the Thelma White case that he has become a believer in integration within the American community, or at least he was accepting the reality. And so some did not, and those who did not, I think, were unwilling to change the societies in which they lived. How do we deal with that?
As far as those first black students that were enrolled at Texas Western College, how many of them paid out-of-state tuition?
Let me see. I could go back and check, but I think about maybe a third of them. In other words, 3. I think 9. The ones I'm thinking about. Well, you have 2 from El Paso, and several from, or at least 1 or 2 from Houston. I can only think of 3. I think they were the ladies who returned, came from out of state. 2 of them, I believe, came from California. Now, that's an interesting question, because even today, our dear president of UTEP now, Dr. Nadlicio, often she will get correspondence because people assume that UTEP is a historically black institution. And when I went to the Basketball Hall of Fame, I used to live within 30 miles of it, they have the 66 basketball team in the segment for historically black colleges. And it was very funny talking to one track star who was persuaded to come here by a coach, and he was getting off the plane, and he looked up and he said, where are all of these sombreros coming from? He said, did they make a wrong turn or something? And so even now, there are people who argue. I actually went to get back to the Basketball Hall of Fame, I went to the executive director and said, no, UTEP is not a historically black college, and ultimately within about 2 or 3 months, they moved the exhibit up to the first floor. It was in the basement, by the way.
You know, that's interesting, because I worked for a Newsweek magazine for 10 years, and I graduated from the University of Texas at El Paso, and they would always ask me, is that a black university or black college? Which is interesting.
Yeah.
Dr. Daly, I think when we're talking about the students in that first class in 1955, it's important to note who was not there, and that was Thelma White. You want to talk about that?
Yes, yes. Thelma White, and from all I've read, Bob, and you can, I really admire your command of this subject matter. Apparently, she decided she wanted to stay at NMSU, and
well, she had no barrier to entry there, so she was, while she was doing the court fight, she was able to enroll in New Mexico.
Yeah, yeah. And once she got there, felt a little bit more comfortable. And her daughter was also invited to this anniversary celebration, and talked about why her mother did not want to come to UTEP. And apparently, it was a feeling that she would be looked upon as a pariah. But you look at the initial 12, while they had those kinds of problems, they were at least willing to try to fight that system.
What president had to deal with Governor George Wang?
What president?
Was it in the, when they were trying to go inside to the school?
In which situation? You mean, well, it's Eisenhower in Little Rock.
And in,
It was John, that was with Wallace was in 1962, so it was President Kennedy who had the initial battle with him. But that continued with Lyndon Johnson. As a matter of fact, Wallace challenged Johnson in the Democratic primary in 1964 with not much success, and then, of course, mounted their third-party candidacy in 1968. The legendary stand in the schoolhouse door that Wallace did was while Kennedy was president in 1962.
thank you.
I wonder what you, maybe I can toss a question back to you, because when one is looking at this information from the optic, if you will, of a black scholar, and one takes LBJ, he really becomes an enigma in many ways, and even in some ways Judge Thomason, because on one hand we have an account that Judge Thomason may have been a member of the KKK, and then we have another book that says absolutely not, that he was in the vanguard of the liberal change. And Charles, do you have any reading of that? My distinguished colleague, Charles Martin.
I don't know anything specifically on Judge Thomason, but it wouldn't have been particularly unusual if you were in certain organizations that where members joined the Klan initially when it came to El Paso, and members of, well, if you were Methodist, one of the Methodist churches had a lot of members. If you're in one of the Shriners or other groups, Almeida Shrine, lots of their members joined initially anyway. So if you were Catholic, you weren't going to join the Klan. So to some extent, and generally if you were part of the political or business establishment, you're not likely to join the Klan. But if you were kind of an insurgent, you might have joined it because it was considered to be a perfectly proper middle-class white Protestant institution in the 20s. Remember, it's the anti-Catholicism that's stressed in the Southwest especially, not so much the anti-black side of, although they had that side, but it was more on the anti-Catholicism that was played up. And to some extent that becomes anti-Mexican also.
Where did that come from?
There is the, well, there's, Charles, what's the book on Nixon? Conrad Bryson, is it? Yeah, the book on Nixon. Conrad Bryson repudiates that Judge Thompson could have had.
But where did the charge come? I was curious because there was a book by a man named Sean Lay at UTEP who wrote, and there have been several requests of lists because he had said, I mean, I spoke to Tom Lee and he talked with such disdain about a Baptist minister who was a member of the Klan. You know, so for this charge that his father was a member, but there have been requests for, you know, a role or some kind of proof, and there never has been any. I always found it curious that no requests for information from him have ever been forthcoming. Because my experience with historians who love their subject is they share information, and I don't know where that I've heard that about Lee. I don't know if that was the same. The same charge came from Sean Lay.
Yeah, the same charge from
but
Lay.
There's never been proof. I mean, there was no proof. It was just kind of a statement that's then been picked up again.
Well, there are many Protestant ministers that endorsed the Klan in El Paso. And a lot of people joined initially, but their membership drops off very quickly too. But they were insurgents. So if you were affiliated with what we might call the downtown business establishment and the local political establishment, they were very hostile to those groups. So if you were a political insurgent, you might have some initial sympathy for them before you begin to see what they're actually doing. Then their membership falls off pretty quickly.
Sam, what would be your reading of this? No. Okay. Okay. Okay, well, that's brief and to the point. Thank you. But it's interesting. I think what some important black historians are doing now is something that's been done in the anthropological field. They're turning the camera around, and rather than so much looking at black leaders who were effective and engaged in the civil rights movement. The question then is, that's important, the question is, who are your allies and what are they trying to achieve? And the more and more I read LBJ, I hear echoes of strength of Booker T. Washington. Because LBJ's preoccupation with power and influence, and let me read you this one quote that by Robert Caro on the Senate. He says this, LBJ, it was not compassion that most fully satisfied his needs, but rather power. Not the desire to help somebody, but the desire to be somebody. And you can, it's a statement that can be used in many ways to get someone to enlist in your cause if that person sees an opportunity for influence, for power. And I think that there is that component in LBJ, in the sense that things I read about him at one point when he was first running for office, he was told by someone in Austin that he could never get elected with that city boy urban hat that he was wearing. And then he shifts to the cowboy hat. And then people who go in and talk with him said that he would use a southern drawl if he felt that would persuade you, or else he would use cowboy language if he felt that would. So he was code switching depending on the people coming in. Do you think that's? Yeah, it's interesting, but he's certainly fascinating. The first time I came to him through of all things was through a person you would know here. I think it's H. Rap Brown, and H. Rap Brown and a few black leaders invited to the White House, and it was H. Rap Brown who stepped out of line, so to speak, and he was chastised severely by the other civil rights leaders, because what LBJ was saying to him is, I want to meet with more constructive black leaders, not the radical kind, creating all this noise and upsetting. In this case, one of his relatives. Good. Anything else? Good. Well, thank you very much.